And so, yeah, welcome to this workshop. And we'll start with the presentation around the feedback to the summary of the quality of life survey.
Sure, for those of you who have not had a chance to meet Nathan Brown, he's our policy data analyst, so this is BAU for him. I'll turn it over to him. He's done a slide deck that was actually at the end of this that picks out some of the key things and present those, and that will probably precipitate the questions and discussions for the council. Just emphasizing that, you know, with the 8th year running, this is turning into a really valuable longitudinal data set for the council that we can build on. So with that, I will hand it over to you.
Good to go. Okay, so yeah. So yeah, quality of life survey. So obviously our annual resident wellbeing survey. It was over 5 weeks during October, November last year, getting just after the election finished. A sample of residents are invited to participate in the survey, but all residents are able to participate through advertised link via Let's Talk. This year we got 1,767 responses, which was a bit up from last year. And we had 330 responses to a separate kind of non-resident survey that we run in conjunction with this. The final survey samples, stratified sample of 1,000 of those responses, which we use to best represent the district's demographics. Which gives the results in the report a margin of error of plus or minus 3%. So just give it time as we go through.
Can I ask you one question already?
Yes.
Sorry. When we talk about randomly selected residents, do we mean ratepayers who are on the electoral roll, or if we're talking wider, how do we work out who are our residents?
We use the electoral roll to do the sample, yeah, and then we either send a letter in the mail, or we can match their email address to the ratepayers database that we'll email them.
So is it just ratepayers, or is it
everyone on the electoral roll?
Okay, so
that's
all residents. Okay, yeah, thank you.
I actually met someone on the weekend that did it.
No, that never happened.
Yeah, I got sent it last year.
So, right, so therefore they could be someone who lives outside the district, but that the registered place residence is the district. Cool. Thank you.
So the key results, so residents rating the quality of life as good or better was at 74%. That was slightly down last year, but still fairly solid result on the scale of things. 19% said their quality of life had decreased to some extent in the last year, and 30% had, 9% said it increased, and 30% said it decreased to some extent. And both of those were slight improvements from last year. The main reason we had for people saying their quality of life had decreased was cost of living, obviously. But positively, though, those staying housing stress had decreased the second year running. And one of the big positives to come out of this survey was the results of those saying they had a sense of pride in the district and saying they would recommend the district. So those saying they had a sense of pride increased from 63 to 70%, and those recommending the district increased slightly from 59 to 62%. So a couple of good results there. And overall, kind of the main themes that come out of the open-ended questions that we asked throughout the survey. Little change from previous years. Cost of living, coupled with low income, uncut low incomes, housing, infrastructure concerns, access to health services, which continues to be a more prevalent theme as the years go on, as well as the need for an improved transport system. Moving on to housing, much of these kind of saw improvements last year, 23 to 24. But they kind of reverted back to those 2023 levels this year. So we had 18% of residents say they need to move in the last 12 months, which is up from 15%, and 10% say they had access to temporary or insecure accommodation, which is up from 5% in the previous year. And those without a steady place to live or worry about losing in the future was unchanged at 20%. We teased out that question around insecure accommodation this year to kind of work out just what that insecure accommodation was. 6% responded they need to rely on friends or family, while 2% stayed in poor quality accommodation and 2% stayed they'd sleep in their car. Kind of breaking down that question a bit further, younger residents who were kind of disproportionately represented in those groups, particularly those aged 18 and 24. With about 17% of those that had to rely on friends or family for their accommodation. 10% had to sleep in a car, and 5% actually had to sleep on the street at some point. There was very little differences in the results across the boards in the district, and the verbatim questions continue to reiterate that concerns from prior years being housing affordability, availability, and quality. And therefore, the housing market was unattainable for even those on decent income. The rental market was becoming increasingly difficult to the point that many residents were kind of having to up sticks and move out of the district. And then there was further comments we get around the kind of infrastructure required to support the housing development and the suitability of new developments in terms of their kind of design and aesthetics with the wider community.
Just got a question around the framing of one of the questions. Is having to sleep in their car. I know of a few young people that choose to sleep in their car. How do we differentiate between them?
Yeah, it's probably depends on how they kind of interpret the question. So the options we take there are based off, there's a stats that do a whole heap of different options there. So we're just basically copying their options for those questions there. Yeah, it's kind of, as with some of these questions, some of them are open to interpretation.
And it's probably quite telling that you would choose to sleep in your car. It's probably a financial decision.
That's significant.
Yeah.
It's obviously the rent versus
It's still the case that the rent is extremely high.
Yeah.
This is the sample of people who this is sent to, though, are people who are enrolled to vote here. So that is a something to keep in mind. That's people who don't see themselves as being here temporarily for their longer term residents because they are enrolled to vote. So that's probably a slightly different.
And it gets sent to them over email or physically, because if they're sleeping in your car, it's not going to like turn up your car, is it?
No.
But for some subdivisions or communities, they can't get mail anyway. So not saying you might as well live in your car because you can get mail, but it's not like.
Yeah, a lot of people are using it online.
Yeah, so people who are choosing to live in a van while they trip around New Zealand and then maybe spend some time here, and there are quite a few tiny homes like that around here that would be deemed a vehicle because that's the only way that they can legally have it on their property or a property. So yeah, maybe it's something that if we want to perhaps look at in some more depth, what does that actually look like? Because there's the people on the sort of the periphery, aren't they? Some of them choosing to, others are being forced to. Understanding that would be really interesting.
I think it would be interesting actually, because the fact that they're enrolled to vote implies that they were living somewhere at some point, because you have to have an address in order to be able to enroll to vote, because that's what determines that you are resident in an area.
Yeah.
So that that might be actually quite interesting to dig into, because that would imply that people who did have somewhere to live but have had to live in their car.
especially in hospitality and tourism, it's like nomadic workers who do 6 months here, 6 months overseas. And so for them, it's actually makes sense.
Yes, and they wouldn't be included in this. Yeah.
Wow, cool.
So jobs and income, so the main theme mentioned regarding jobs and income is around the cost of living versus wages, specifically the wages are too low to cover cost of living easily, even for residents who don't have a good income. We had additional comments around the lack of economic diversity, limited opportunities outside those tourism and hospitality, retail, construction sectors. There was also an increased amount of comments from business owners around the high costs that they encounter. Despite those verbatim comments, there were some positive results from the survey. So we had residents reporting at least some disposable income marginally increased, while resident perceptions of their employment increased across all categories. Significantly so, those agreeing they had learned something new in the last 12 months, and that the skills being used to full capacity. We had residents that see a long-term career path in the district also increased from 41 to 46%, as those agreeing they had opportunities for career advancement, which increased from 38 to 41%. Access to health services continues to be a growing concern, along with the adequacy of the current facilities that we have. Many residents commented on the need for an expanded local hospital, I'm sure you're all aware. The cost and difficulty of accessing GP services and the availability of mental health services. So all kind of comments that we've seen before, they're growing in voices as the years go on. Regarding barriers to accessing health services, cost of appointment continues to be the main barrier, followed by length of wait. And those reporting no barriers to accessing health services is decreasing at 35%. That's been down kind of each year from 2019, it was 47%. Residents in the kind of Wanaka Upcliff area are more likely to need to travel for healthcare and more likely to cite length of wait and the cost of accessing after hours services as a barrier to getting that healthcare. We look kind of specifically at the mental health services. We asked a few questions this year that we hadn't asked since 2021. A bit of a step change between that year and now. So it's interesting to see how that's changed with a bit of time gap between the two questions. So we had significant increases in residents having access to mental health services. So 34% of residents did this through the GP. I think every category there on the left has grown significantly since we asked in 2021. Conversely, there was significant reductions in residents' perceptions of mental health services. 37% agreed that there was enough mental health services, or they knew where to get mental health support, which was down to 55%. And 25% agreed that nothing stopped them getting mental health support, down to 39% in 2021. And unchanged from last time, but quite low, that only 8% agreed there was sufficient mental health services in the district. And residents in the Arrowtown Carrell ward were more likely to have access to mental health services. 54% of those stating that they or someone in their household have access to at least some of the services listed. We're going kind of culture, creative and heritage, so we asked basic questions. There were two needs to know that came out of the vacant questions in these, that being around the Maori and cultural representation across the district. As we've seen previously, many kind of thought this was underrepresented. Well, there's another portion of the district that feels kind of overwhelmed with the focus on this culture. Kind of second main thing to come out of it was a desire for more investment in the arts and cultural spaces, which is something we've seen previously through the LCP process as well, particularly around an arts and culture centre over in the Wanaka area. We get a lot of comments around that particularly. Positively, about 66% of residents reported they attended an event in the district over the last 12 months. That was the highest result since 2018. However, we still had 65% reporting barriers to attending events, most commonly being cost, followed by access through parking and the like.
Do we collect information or ask people to whether they identify as Maori in this survey?
Yes. Yep.
So what are we? Because I didn't see any reporting on what our population trends are in terms of that within the survey.
Sorry, just here.
Okay. Thank you.
It was around about 7 or 8%.
It's designed to match whatever is in the census. So this isn't the tool for tracking the change in demographics. We'd use the census for that, and then we use a sample drawn from the census to go to the population survey recipient list.
Page 13 of the report.
Thank you.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I think around 6% or 7%.
So I've heard much higher figures. So I was just wondering where we. Okay.
I mean, it is we are one of the fastest growing Maori districts, but it's from quite a low base.
Yeah.
Percentage-wise, very high.
I know thinks it's higher than what is reported in the census.
No, it quite possibly is. No.
Thank you.
So regarding transport, comments here centred around the ongoing difficulty getting around the district, obviously due to congestion, and comments that continued growth is likely to make these issues worse. We had safety concerns from cyclists and walkers also being highlighted. Many believe this kind of reinforced vehicle dependency. Further comments around price increases on public transport making it unaffordable, while it's kind of known lack of parking, particularly around town centres, obviously.
Has public transport actually gone up in price?
It did during this time period.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it hadn't gone up in sort of the full.
Yeah, because it's like $2 or $2.50.
Yeah.
Right, so it's not so much. Yeah.
Typically see that's actually gone up year on year. It used to be $7 to catch the bus.
Yeah.
You know, 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah.
There was still perceptions of affordability were a lot better then than they are now. So whether that's a,
Yeah, it's kind of
a
what I
reflection
thought.
of
Yeah,
reflection of what's going on wider in the district as well.
yeah.
It's a perception thing, so, yeah, and before that it was even more expensive and much less of it, so people's expectations are changing.
I think the government changed people's expectations when they made it cheaper.
Yeah.
And then, yeah,
And
so
it's
it's hard to
taken
go back.
away, but even
Yeah.
then it's still relatively
Yeah.
affordable.
Yeah.
I think the public transport part is interesting because I'm pretty sure if you talk to ORC, the patronage on public transport has been increasing significantly. So the percentage might not be increasing, but the actual number I
Yeah.
think is. Certainly the services that have been made available are, we have one of the highest uptakes of public transport, I think, across Otago. Definitely in Otago, if not wider. So
And how much of that patronage is residents or visitors? Yeah. You see quite a
yeah,
people. looking at
exactly.
this bus stop.
True.
A lot of people walk. You know, from to make us laugh.
Someone's proposing. Anyway, Karen.
We had kind of the use of alternative transport, which is kind of the figures detailed there on that slide, decreased for all modes of transport, which is a slightly concerning result, but we'll see how the trend continues for that going forward. And a significant decrease in that is that biking, at least monthly, dropped from 42% last year to 35% this year. It's the first time we've kind of actually seen a decrease in every category across the board.
And this was before the track was closed.
Yeah. Kind of, you know, despite those metrics, despite most metrics around public transport, which is those ones on the left there around accessibility and easy to get to and frequency, they're also still quite low. In general, residents find public transport inadequate, particularly in terms of frequency and reliability. 90% satisfy the needs of residents, and subsequently, especially in case they're residing outside of those central Queenstown suburbs. We have a look at the graph on the right there is the one comparing users to non-users. Obviously, users have a better perception of public transport than non-users, which kind of gets closer to matching what OIC stats have around their public transport when they survey cross users.
But nonetheless, even the users are saying only 50% of them believe it's frequent. Yeah. And 48%. Yeah, that's quite low. Just the users.
Yeah.
And comments around neighbourhoods people lived in, so many positive comments, particularly those living in small areas, or those who've been here a long time. These people noted that the community was kind of safe, welcoming and supportive. Other comments had around kind of the changing feel of their community through increase of short-term housing, transient residents, overcrowded homes, and new developments coming into the area. Results kind of regarding kind of sense of community, little changed, however there was a decrease in those they rely on their neighbours in an emergency. Obviously we only started asking that question last year, so it's two bit of data there. Kind of those in central Queenstown less likely to agree with volumetrics. Small areas like Glenorchy and Hawiya more likely to agree. Perceptions around safety and participation, little change every year. 93% agreed that neighbourhood was safe, 80% agreed that built spaces in the neighbourhood were accessible. Again, those in Queenstown less likely to agree they participate in neighbourhood activities, while those in the Wanaka area more likely to agree, or less likely to agree that the community was accepting of different cultures.
I think that the point about safety is worth really highlighting. There are many parts of the country and indeed the world that keep their right arm as a result that is both of those kind of elements.
Isn't it interesting though, because I was just thinking, who's the 10% that doesn't feel safe?
Yeah,
I want to know who they are. What we can put there.
Yeah, Nikki, got a question.
Thanks, John. Sorry, I'm not there. Yeah, just interested in, did we break down that last score of accepting of different cultures into the different cultures and who perceives it?
We don't, but we could. We also have the data there in the background, so we can split it out.
Yeah, I'd be quite interested to see that. Yeah, that's all. Thanks.
Onto the environment. So main comments here around lack of knowledge and awareness of both kind of curbside and district-wide recycling, and kind of they are unsure about what they could and couldn't recycle, and skepticism around what actually gets recycled. Other comments from the balance between growth and environmental issues, obviously such as the water and wastewater infrastructure, as well as the impact tourism has on the environment. Perceptions about recycling, little changes again year on year. 80% agree that it's worth taking the time to get recycling rights. 80% confident they recycle correctly, but only 23% know what happens to their recycling, and 40% agree they're confident that everything they recycle actually ends up getting recycled. And we had 68% say no concern with the impacts of climate change, down last year to 71%, and the lowest level since we started monitoring this.
I will ask the question of the waste men's team and the communications teams for their insights around the knowledge of what happens and the confidence around recycling. I think it's worth understanding why that might be. Is that a narrative component, or is it actually, is there a reason for that?
I remember there was one story that came out that we'd done millions of tons of recycling, and I think it's really hard to then get back on top of that.
Those stories do cast a really long shadow.
Yeah. Plastics going to Malaysia and then being burnt en masse.
Yeah,
Stuff like that.
and not just here, like
Yeah.
nationally.
Yeah, globally, probably.
Yeah.
If you read through the comments, a lot of them are kind of, they're not first hand, they're very much someone told me that, it all goes to waste anyway. So like, well,
Yeah. So, Vicky, did you want to add?
Thanks. Yeah, I just thought it might be a good time to ask. It's a general question, but on this one, it's quite important to understand what the teams are doing with the information that they take from this and how are they reporting back to us on any actions taken. So obviously this one where I'm not confident that what I'm recycling is getting recycled. I mean, that could have massive implications for, the reuse of that material. How maybe to Michelle, but sorry, I'll understand if you don't know, but how do we use this information and then report back on the actions?
So I think historically we don't report back on actions because there aren't actions per se that fall out of this, but this is used as the primary piece of data and evidence for a whole range of activities across the organisation. Obviously we've gone public with the information we're sharing with you. I think the next step of the process is to understand, are there any specific areas that we need to brief more deeply on this? But it is pretty well understood institutionally as one of our core pieces of data and evidence. So it's not a mechanism for formally coming back, but you would see in the pieces of work that are coming back to you in workshop environments, and expect to be able to ask the question, does this align with our what we're hearing in the quality of life survey? But that's something we can take away and give a little bit more thought to if the group wants something a little more explicit on that front.
Well, I think for me, reading through it, a lot of the things are just the same from year to year. It's obviously an expensive thing to do. There are 4 questions where they ask for additional information, and we've got a smattering of responses to questions. And I'm talking question 43, 48, 51, 57, where they say, if you've got anything else to say on these issues. We don't see those responses and we don't see any actions fall out of this. And I think it's worthwhile doing this, but I think given that we're spending ratepayers' money on this, I think it's important that we see what comes back out of it. So I would like to see the responses to those questions if we can. So 43, 48, 51, 57. I'd just like to see what people have said about their neighbourhoods. For example, Fernhill isn't doing as well as some other areas, and sort of those community questions. Be really interested to see what they might have said, and then so that we at a governance level can then go back and feed that into our work, not just because this is valuable to governance as well as the organisation at a management level.
Yes, I completely agree, Nikki. And I mean, the entire piece of work should be helping to define our overall, as an organisation, our priorities, our work programmes, our direction, it's critical for your thinking in the LTP and what are the things that matter and what will change the dial.
Exactly.
Those particular questions, have we got the verbatim for those that we can share? I thought we'd already done it. Yeah, we can
No,
do
that would be great. I would really like to see the answers to them. For me, particularly the environment ones, having that portfolio over this side of the hill. But if
It's
you could
already, Nikki, it's already been shared, I think. Am I saying, have I got that
oh,
right?
sorry, I haven't seen the answers to all the questions.
So the verbatim was shared with the councillors probably 2-3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, great. Sorry, Kerry, I missed that.
Yeah, apologies, it'll be a different thread than the worksheet slide deck today.
Okay, can I ask you?
Okay, so that's under an email from Kerry.
It'll be from Nathan, but we can recirculate that if that's gotten lost because we.
That would be really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Perfect.
I
Okay.
was just going to circle back to the recycling. Do we actually have a figure what is the percentage of what's collected in the bins actually is recycled? And if so,
Yes.
how do we let people know what? Because that's the obvious answer to the figure, isn't it?
Yeah. So as part of the waste minimisation management plan that was put together last year, there was a waste minimisation study, that's not the right word for it, that does exactly that. And there is data collected throughout the year, and it's one of the KPIs that they report on is how much material is recycled. So I can get Sophie or Laura to circulate that. I think the other telling thing here is that even though 14% of people say confident it gets recycled, 87% of the same people said, I think it's worth time taking to get it right. And 88% saying I'm confident I've got the right things in the recycling. Yeah. So even though they have a suspicion that it's not going to the right place, they're still doing the right thing. But I can get the waste team to circulate that, the latest data on that.
And a lot of the stuff that isn't recycled is because it's contaminated. So it has to go to landfill.
That's right.
Which is huge, actually, in the grand scheme of it.
Yeah.
So that statistic about the lack of confidence could just mean that they know that the system tosses some of it out and it doesn't get recycled. So it might not be bad, it's just that they understand how the system works.
Yeah.
So sometimes you have to think about what we're actually seeing here. Yeah. It could be the opposite to what we assume is being said just because the numbers low.
Yeah, we did actually do a great tour of recycling plant and it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it's amazing.
Should do that again.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you.
And just briefly on the non-resident, so I mentioned that we do a non-resident survey in conjunction with this one. So we've got 330 responses to that, which is a bit of a drop from what we had in the last 2 years, but we're getting around 700. Some of the main themes we have traffic congestion, loss of character through developments and affordability issues. The key results included here in this slide with safety and community facilities rating highly, affordability, public transport and adequacy of healthcare rating lower. So we'll leave it at that. If there's any further questions or feedback, to take on board.
I think following from Nikki's, I think it would be interesting. I don't necessarily think like actions or KPIs necessarily, but like when you guys are coming back with certain things to go, this is so that we can, you know, change this metric on quality of life. Okay. You know, like to pull it back to that. I mean, so that we do remember that we're trying to make some changes here and why we're doing things, you know.
In many cases, it is our primary source of information. You know, when we're doing policy work or when work's happening across the district, because a lot of this isn't reported in this kind of granular detail, and definitely not at small community level.
Yeah.
So we do lean into it a lot.
Yeah, but it would be good to bring it back because sometimes it's easy to forget sometimes why we're doing this. You know. Yeah.
And it's somewhat of a different vehicle, but a lot of this data is used to inform what KPIs are in the long-term plan.
Yeah.
So that's a way to track how things are going, but that's a different.
Yeah, because obviously, housing, you've actually changed the dial on that. That's probably part of change KPIs that you've had. So I think even though you can say that things haven't moved, I think they have.
Some.
I think Nikki's wanting to speak. Nikki.
And as usual, I just forgot my question. So it was just around how do we use this in our in the work we do? And I just wanted to point out the health responses received from the Upper Clutha community, and then just question how that's been, you know, progressed through our approach to the regional deal. Just highlighting my concern that maybe we don't necessarily focus on it. I would have thought there would be more reference to this and the need to have something that makes things much more accessible for the Upper Clutha community based on that feedback over time.
So this particular year's feedback is not included in the regional deal, because all of the source material was generally drawn from last year's one. However, I mean, I think if you were to go through the sources, Penny can probably speak more to the regional deal, but in general, in our work going forward, as I say, this is a primary source of evidence. So not only is it used to sort of drive or build business cases that may or may not come into this room to develop a piece of work, it also is used to sort of complement and fill gaps in some of our evidence base. So the information there, for example, from the non-resident ratepayers around their appetite to rent out properties is used as an adjunct to our thinking around the entire housing mix here, and other pieces of evidence that have been put together to support other strands within that housing work. This is an important component. So it's used in some reasonably sophisticated ways, I would say, throughout the organisation. It's pretty woven in. But Penny, do you want to talk to the health one specifically?
So in relation to the health one, yeah, the quality of life survey results from previous years are part of the evidence base behind why health is one of the packages in the regional deal. As you will know from the discussions about the regional deal, that is what health service improvements end up happening will be driven by the results of the clinical services plan that's being done by the Ministry of Health. That draws on the same residents to gather the information. So they have gathered information from residents.
I understand. I guess I'm just talking about
and Wakatipu.
I guess I'm just talking about how we advocate. This is our piece of work. Absolutely, health is not our thing, but we're collecting information and it's how we feed that back. I would have expected, looking at this, if we do use this this information specifically, that there would have been more of a focus on the difficulties in the Upper Clutha and needing to get something closer.
I mean, that was a
for that
community deal work, and I know it was also used by the Health Services Action Group. They drew on this as a source, a data source as well. I mean, all of our advocacy work carries extremely particular on this, is making sure that any claim we're making in our advocacy work, we've got a source to back it up, and the source is very often this quality of life survey.
Okay.
Exactly, well, I guess the government doesn't have the.
I guess maybe it would be helpful, just going forward, and I'm going back to where Nicola was going, you know, report back to us on where it gets used. So, you know, in our reports that come to council on various things, we talk about which strategies and policies of the council have been considered, but maybe we need to also look at where feedback, other sources of information that have been considered, and more specifically, so that you can draw our eye back to the why. That would be helpful.
I think that's a fair comment, Nikki, and I suspect that very often it doesn't necessarily be drawn back to this, because as you've seen, there's quite a lot of consistency in the message in here, and sometimes I suspect it just validates what we think everyone already understands. So I think we can ensure that we're keeping a focus on good sourcing in our documentation and demonstrating where the driver is coming from, and if we feel this is going to drive change in this space. I think that's a really valid point.
I think it is, this information is used on both sides. So one of the primary reasons for this is for us to measure and monitor the effectiveness of some of the things that we are doing. So that's a number of the KPIs in the LGP are measured by what's in here. And so we use this to determine whether the interventions that we are taking in some of these areas are effective, where those interventions are ours, because obviously some of them aren't, and they then inform other things like health. So that informs your advocacy. But just to reassure you, in terms of the discussions with central government on health, from both officials, officers, us, and from the joint committee members, there has definitely been a focus on improved services in the Upper Clutha as well as in Queenstown. So sometimes people get a bit lost in where would we put a hospital, which we are not providing a view on where a hospital goes, but there is a lot more to health service improvements that need to be made than a hospital. And a lot of the discussions have talked about
Yes.
other improvements in both.
But it is part of the mix, is what I'm saying. And I just think I'm just pointing out that there seems to be a little bit of a disconnect there with what we're hearing on the survey and where we were advocating potentially.
This is consistent with what we're advocating for through the regional.
It's very consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. But we will continue to try and make this as explicit as possible. What I would just emphasise
Thanks,
is
Michelle.
it's a very integrated, institutionally speaking, this has now over time become very integrated into the way we work. That's not always the way with pieces of evidence and data, because we're in control of it in the sense that we can make sure it happens year on year. Whereas so when we're relying on sources from third parties, ORC, central government, they do have a tendency to make unilateral changes to their data sources and the patterns and the cadence that are out of our control. So it's very, very helpful for us.
That's one question. Thanks, John. So I absolutely understand the need to carry on asking the same questions year on year and or as close as we can, so we can get comparative data. How do we work out, and how would councillors be involved in suggesting what else might we want to ask?
So Nathan does a huge number of meetings across the organisation with activity groups about what their key priorities are, as well as then analysing what's been done in the past. So that, I mean, the balance here that you will be well aware of is that it'd be lovely if we could ask a 500 question survey, because then we could ask everything, but we can't because it already is quite long. So those trade-offs happen within the activity groups of what's new, what's coming up, what's burning, and then it goes through a lot of different people. Do you have anything to add to that on that process?
No, of course, we have our questions to be asked year on year to keep that time series data and come out. Questions that we kind of cycle in every few years, and then we'll have our kind of, I guess, questions that inform a particular piece of work, kind of one-off basic questions, and we all put them into the mix, and we also try and keep it to a reasonable level that's not too arduous to complete.
So there are new questions every year, but there's always a standard base.
Around this table we wanted to
I think
throw in there. How would that sort of happen? What would
So-
the process?
Some years there's a process where there's a work, I can't remember how we did this last year actually, but some years it's a process where it comes to a workshop before it goes live. What I would just countenance for all of your collective wisdom is that in the early days of doing this, we were very council-led in the questions, and it did lead to some challenges. There is some value of having a third-party organisation that tells us whether the question is a good one and it's well crafted, and et cetera, et cetera. But yes, we would really welcome your feedback. If there are areas and gaps where you feel we should be leaning into, actually let us know that at any point in the year. You don't need to wait for the point at which we're putting this live. But we can maybe think about how we surface those questions in advance of going live, so that you've got that final view.
John.
Cool. So with a couple of degrees in geography, I think this is marvellous. But what other users are there of this? Do you talk to, because I'm thinking the high schools in particular, economics, geography, stats, they could all be using this as a practical set of data. Do you have those sort of conversations?
Not so much with the high schools, but we have conversations with external organisations within the district, like talk to actually Monica, speak to NTA and Ministry of Health and the like.
Right.
So there are
Actual users of it.
there are actual users
Thousand or trust.
in terms of actually taking the results. In terms of taking the results out to schools and the like.
And they're always available on council's website for anybody to pull.
The whole data, just the answers, just the high level.
The 100 pages or something. Yeah.
Good job. Matt, question. What sort of timelines or lens should you be looking at this data over? There's a danger in looking at it over just 12 months. But then similarly, you don't probably want to go out too far because the trends have moved. So I guess if we're looking at this from an expert point of view, if we're framing policy changes, because I've seen this quality of life survey being used in reports by staff when we're doing management plans and the like. But again, framing of the data to suit a narrative potentially could be quite challenging or dangerous.
So what sort of time frame is recommended to look at this data?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's obviously COVID provides a big kind of blip in the data, and it's, you know, year 2020, 2021, and you know, thinking further back to that, kind of you having to caveat it all the time. I think the longer the period you have is fine. You're going back to however long. I think the longer the data, the better is to see how things are changing over time. But obviously, there are those caveats within the data around certain time frames when things happened that impacted, you know, before and after. I think if you're looking at kind of a recent snapshot, then kind of going from 2021 onwards, kind of works as a kind of rebuild, I guess, phase. Yeah. The issues we're seeing post COVID. But for me, I think you can go back to
yeah. Certainly, though, some of the depth of the challenges that sit behind some of the things raised in here aren't things you can fix in a year. I think that's what you're getting at. So the health services one, say we got everything we wanted agreed to in the next 6 months for improvement of health services, we wouldn't see an improved result for the quality of life survey next year, because it will still take a number of years to implement and increase the services that we're receiving. So
well, some of those things will kick in pretty quickly, like
some will, but
like the
a lot
blood
of
tests and X-rays and stuff in Monaco will have a massive impact on those things in the short term.
Yeah, so but there are a lot of these things are long-term fixes. So
some of them are, yeah.
Transport things,
Yeah.
even if we got agreement tomorrow and let's say we got $1 billion and agreement to every project we wanted, we wouldn't see the benefits of that for a number of years. In fact, it might get worse before it gets better.
Yeah, but it's sort of like that, because as we show the LTP, for example, and we decide where the funding's going, we may be looking at this to say, okay, how do people use transport now? Active travel, where's that set? Should we be actually investing in active travel? Because most people are walking or cycling, but we've under-invested in that, so let's prioritise that. So that's sort of what I'm thinking. You know, these long-term patterns should be shaping our LTP rather than knee-jerk 12 months or whatever it is.
And the irony of it is that there are things other than the level of the service you're getting that will impact how people feel about it. Like the cost of petrol will impact people's satisfaction. The cost, so how the economy is and whatever. So yeah, I mean, we've got to be always conscious of those other things that affect people's feelings.
It really comes down to
how we act as a council will also affect people's feelings regardless of the level of service they get. You know, people will feel better about their bins being collected if they trust the council that its delivery is collecting them.
The context is everything in this, and that comes down to that, lies and statistics kind of a conversation, but which is why it always does have to be have this kind of level of discussion. It's why we do look at the questions year on year. There is the tension between some of these questions between reality and perception as well, or provability and perception. But it's all if the perception piece is, we think, casting a long shadow, for example, like with the recycling, comes back to the trust conversation. So this doesn't stand entirely in isolation from the trust and confidence survey, which is run separately. These two contribute to the whole picture.
In terms of continuity of the questions year on year, we've had pretty consistent questioning the whole way through. So
I think those kind of, I guess, well-being type questions, we've kind of kept them consistent from since implemented. And as we kind of add further ones in, kind of get them. We don't like to change the questions too much. So.
No, because you're not comparing apples with apples.
Yeah.
Yep.
Very good. Well, I'm mindful of the time. So if there's anything burning, we should thank you. Look forward to next year.
Love to see.
And actually, sorry, without breaking down a complete rabbit hole, there will be another survey which is coming out, which is the Trust in Council sort of thing.
Trust and confidence one.
Yeah, thank you. Can you really quickly just update us on what the plan is for that?
So that's out for responses now. It closes next week, I believe. We'll get the final results for that kind of back in May, I'd imagine. And then for the same process as this.
And that's a similar sort of targeted Again,
Yeah, so
that's
that's,
a section of respondents.
Yeah, so that's purely invite only. So we've sent that out to 3,500 residents. Yeah, and that's an invite only survey.
So there isn't the self-selection option to start with. Look forward to seeing if we shifted the dust.
And the response rate was looking solid this time. We got an update. Thank you. Thank you.
We'll see how that comes back. Just a
This is based on transit.
Morning.
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 Good morning.
Can we make
It's the tree team.
That's a big thing. Fire and trees.
all right? Go for it. Oh, good everyone. So just before we get on, we might do some introductions. I know you guys probably know who we are, but for the benefit of people that may be watching online. So Dave Winsburn, I'm the Parks Manager. Familiar with Brian Pringle, she's part of the Parks team, the Parks Planning Manager. And today we're here to give you a bit of an update on the wildfire program. Yeah. Hey, so a couple of things before we kick off. Just if you guys know, the wildfire program sits within the Parks team mainly because we've got a couple of reasons. We've got the expertise in there, but also that's where the wildfire risk sits, obviously in the parks. We're really conscious that we haven't been back to the council table to give you guys an update for a whole host of reasons, and we're really conscious that we've got some new councillors on, so we wanted to sort of, in terms of today's presentation, take us back a little bit, give a little bit of the history. So just be with us there. Okay, so the purpose of today's update is to give you an update on the current status of the wildfire program and what we're proposing for the direction we're heading for the new LTP. So wildfire is a big risk on a number of our reserves, but since 2023, 2023, I should say, there's been quite a lot of developments. Okay. Technology ones, new developments, relationships and partnerships. So it's sort of changed the context a little bit. And what it might mean is that we have a slightly different approach for the wildfire program, particularly as we get into the new LTP. So I guess we might leave it there and hand it over to you, Brian.
Sure, but I'll just give a bit of background for this next slide. We'll just through here. So council had a report done on all our reserves, and we had 19 reserves that we understood to have a wildfire risk, with 3 of them having an extreme risk, which most people might have heard of, which was Ben Lomond and Queenstown Hill and Mount Iron in terms of being called the red zone. And so from that, as a landowner, we wanted to understand what that risk was and what we could do to reduce that risk. And so we engaged a wildfire expert to come up with a report which came up with recommendations for each reserve on how we could reduce that risk over time. And so the report just didn't look at council, it did look at just our land parcels, so not outside of those reserve areas. But at the same time, it looked at other risks within those parcels, such as the power lines, with Aurora saying to reduce the risk, you could underground the power lines. So we had this report, and with that report, we developed a business case on what we could do to reduce the risk.
Cool. So I thought I was just having a little think. I was sitting in the video, thinking to myself, actually, we might do a little 2-minute history lesson. Okay, just and it clarifies our role, or actually, particularly you guys' role, actually. So back in 2017, and the FENS Act came into play, and it did 2 things. Well, it did actually a number of things, but it did 2 things in relation to today's conversation. So the first thing it did is amalgamated the firefighting responses into one entity for New Zealand. So previously, urban firefighting was RNZ, and then rural fire authorities, councils were the rural fire authorities. I can amalgamate them one. The second thing is it disbanded rural fire authorities, and they were no longer.
So councils had no longer had a role in terms of response to firefighting. Okay. Why I mentioned that is because it really defines our roles and responsibilities. When we are talking today, we are doing it as a landowner, not as a rural forest authority. Okay, it's really important that you take note of that. In our communities, there's still a bit of legacy understanding. So either through misunderstanding, lack of understanding of that legacy, sometimes people think that we are acting as a rural forest authority. Now, that's really relevant when we bring things like what we're talking about today to the table, because we mirror a rural fire authority and we look like that, and it really reinforces that misunderstanding. So you guys might get people that approach you, talk to you like we're a rural fire authority. We're not. That's Fields as well. We're acting as a landowner and we're just maintaining our landowner responsibilities. So it clarifies your role and responsibilities. Okay. But just in the last couple of years, since in probably the last 2 or 3 years, we've had a really strengthened relationship with FENS on the ground. Okay. And so what that's meant is they're really partaking and working with us around some of our landowner responsibilities, particularly in relation to being land. Okay. So they're actively supporting reserve closures and decision making about when we close what are our reserves. That's a big thing. And they endorse QLDC triggers and procedures, and they work with us about enforcing some of the commercial arrangements we have up on the hill. Or actually, sorry, some of the wildfire closures processes we have in relation to the commercial arrangement up on the hill.
So just give you a bit of background to the LTP. So from the report that we had done in 2022, we then had a business case, which in 2023 had a program of works to reduce the risk on the 3 reserves, and that was fed into the LTP. And so 24 million was put in over 10 years to look at reducing the risk on the reserves. One of the main activities was a big fire break proposed around the base of the hills, which would move vegetation back from the urban boundary with a trail in it so that that could be maintained. Otherwise, vegetation just comes back. And the first year of funding is next financial year. So at the moment, we're just working through moving from an indicative business case to a detailed business case, to revisiting that to understand that program of works. And since that time, over 3 years, quite a lot has changed in terms of our understanding of the risk, our relationship with FENS, as Dave just explained, and how that's working and what their role is in that wildfire mitigation. So what we're doing now is we're revisiting that and looking at the recommendations and looking at what we can prioritise to reduce the risk over time. So that's all on that one.
Just clarify, what did you say about the treatment of the fire breaks? You said that they're going to be something else that's happening to them.
So should we? Yeah.
That's it later.
Yeah, we'll go through it and then. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, we might come back to that, Quentin. We got that, but we might come back to that later on.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. So just to talk a little bit about what's gone on the last couple of years. Sorry, switch to that. So since we put our wildfire closure process in place, I thought we'd just talk a little bit about what effect that's had on in terms of the public. So over the last 2 seasons, since we've had a wildfire closure in place, we've had 6 half-day closure periods in Wanaka on Mount Iron specifically. During that period, we've never reached the thresholds for Ben Lomond or Queenstown Hill, so we've not had to close those. I guess that's an indication of the different FWIs or fire weather indices at different locations. There's obviously permanent signage. You just saw a photo. There's permanent signage going in around the reserves. So they really reinforce the closure procedures. We stop public entry into those. And we've got much better at our communications online and sort of bringing their community understanding up. So I think that's probably the key thing. And then the last thing I was going to say, do you want to mention? Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
so yeah. So then, Ben Lomond's a little bit different from the other two reserves because it's got the commercial operators within the reserve. And so while we haven't had a closure yet on Ben Lomond, we've been doing a lot of work in the background with those stakeholders to understand what a closure would look like, especially for their businesses in terms of the financial impacts. So over the past 3 years, working with Skyline, Ziptree, Bungie and GeForce, they came up with a plan with FENS called a readiness plan, and that looks at what they can do in their leasehold areas to continue operating if we were to close the rest of the reserve. So what they've been able to do was that they've done a lot of vegetation management, like limbing up trees and removing wildfire risk around their activity. And then Skyline, over the last 3 years, quite a lot has changed on the hill in terms of the slash that's now been removed and further vegetation clearance where with the work that's been done up on the hill. So working with FENS are now quite happy with that state and have said that if we were to close the reserve, which is to keep those people out of there on the really, really high risk days, Skyline can still operate and have that area at the top that people can evacuate to if there was an event. So that's where they presented the plan, and FENS then endorsed the plan. And council, we didn't have to review the plan as an expert and say that we were happy with it. So it takes the risk away from council, and therefore we can still be a party to it and accept that because FENS are then stepping into that position. So it's meant that we're now in a working relationship where we can move forward each season to look at how we can manage that risk together.
So I guess that's an example of what's the relationship change that's happened in the last 2 or 3 years.
And so the proposed way forward, and this is sort of to answer your question here, Quentin, in terms of Mount Iron, instead of having large fire breaks, which when that heightened fire risk, they may not perform how they're meant to. FENS is saying that it would be better over time to look at a vegetation change. So while Kanuka is that main vegetation on Mount Iron, it is a nursery crop, and it's looking at in some areas where you would plant in more low flammable species that would have been there over time that could slow fires in areas. So the plan over there is to sort of implant in areas to reduce the risk over time and then still use the reserve closures as a way to keep people out of that area when the risk is really high. With Queenstown Hill, again, instead of having the fire breaks, it's looking at a vegetation change over time in terms of reducing that fuel that's up there on that site. And again on Ben Lomond, but looking at it from a top-down vegetation change over time, FENS is saying keeping it away from the infrastructure up the top and then slowly changing vegetation over time to keep that risk down. So looking to the way forward, that we're now building that into a revised business case, which we will then bring to put into the LTP, and also looking at partnerships where we can partner with businesses for whether it's tree removals or replanting opportunities. And there's quite a few options out there at the moment that we're looking at and discussing with groups, especially with the Wilding Group, where they've got some funding where we can partner for Queenstown Hill to remove vegetation and then look at through other programs where we may be able to replant.
Question.
Yes, so there's some, just regarding management of some of the fire breaks and stuff. I mean, I noticed obviously at Mount Iron mowing some of the areas behind the houses, which is relatively easy to do. But I just noticed that the amount of area we're mowing seems to be growing quite a lot. We're mowing right up along the state highway 84, right up to the houses now.
That's not a permanent thing.
No.
And that wasn't done for fire mitigation.
What was it done for?
It was initially it was only meant to mow once a year, but the mow is actually mowed right. You're talking about it on the back end.
Yeah,
it's only meant to go down to the bottom there, when that wasn't meant to go up there. It wasn't done for fire mitigation.
Okay, all right. Well, okay. That's confusing then. All right. Well, work on that. Just regarding the closures now. I mean, we haven't had closure at all this year at Mount Isa, is that right?
Yeah, that's a reflection of the season.
And that was just a lucky thing. So one of the problems we've run into before is that we're basing the closures largely on forecasts as well, but we didn't really have any way to withdraw the closure if those forecasts didn't eventuate. So there were days when, I mean, as I've said before, it was overcast and 19 degrees, but we had a closure, and it was just that the forecast didn't eventuate at all. So I'm just trying to, how do we actually respond to the conditions we're getting as well as the forecasts
Yes, I think we've even evolved since then, as we've moved through the years and with our learning, I think that year we had printed what our closure indices would be, and we had to work off forecasts, but now we're in a much better situation with events where they're coming into that. And we've changed how and we updated our plan this year so that we've got a little bit more room within that orange, I guess it's called, where we can move towards, if the forecast changes suddenly, we can say, actually, no, let's open again. So I think it was quite black and white in our plan, and we had to follow our plan that year. And, that's the risk level that we'd set.
And playing a bigger role.
Whereas before, they were still around the table, but they weren't sort of the active partner, and now we can sort of work together on that. So this year's closure plan is a little bit more fluid around that orange and the weather forecast. Yeah.
I think it's really
specifically to address that challenge, what you're talking about. That's what it's there for.
Yeah, and look, I think it's really helpful that you've deferred a lot of the decision making to Pens, both in the plans and various things. I think that's really helpful. But
so I think Nikki's got it. Yeah, Nikki. Sorry, Nikki. Yeah.
Oh, no apologies necessary. Great to see Fens as an active delivery partner. That's a major win, I think. Just on this change of approach, which I'm taking from the previous report, which is the transition to low flammability vegetation. I guess I'm thinking about Mount Iron specifically, just in terms of the doability of that. It feels like a concept option at this point in time, and I'm just interested to understand, before we build a business case and spend a whole lot of money on that, how doable is it in terms of water availability to transition different plants? Low flammability plants might not necessarily survive well. How do we water them? How do we make sure? Do we have any concept of whether it's doable and what the cost is?
Yeah, we're working with ecologists at the moment, especially closely through the Mount Iron Trail Plan, and so we're looking to understand where areas and what is appropriate to plant. So rather than just sort of doing a blanket plant in terms of changing the species there, we're looking at where it is appropriate and what plants will survive in there. So yeah, it is a really slow process over time.
I just think we need some sort of understanding of the scale of the transition necessary to give the same level of protection as maybe the fire break around the bottom, to understand, I guess I don't want to go spending a whole lot of money on something that is just possibly not doable within budgets, where plants might be planted at great cost and then die because there's no water. This will all be covered presumably in this piece of work, but
it's not a blanket planting covering the hill, and there's ecosystems that have to be protected there anyway, which are different species. So it's just in small areas, and there's more. We're looking to work towards a sort of a plan with areas with the ecologists. So it's not sort of a blanket. Put a lot of money into changing. Putting plants in just to get to that.
Do you know what the process you have more clarity around that?
Yeah, so that's what I was just going to go.
Yeah.
I think we're still in that we're really in the early stages indicative, so we can't tell you that. So
I guess,
but probably what we'll do is partly trying to get set some expectations around how long it's going to take, and before some of those protections actually are realised. So this is not sorted out in a year or two. This is probably a much longer program.
I'm concerned that we had a plan and we paid for the plan and we budgeted for the plan, and now we're flipping the plan to something completely different and we're going to make another plan. And I just, but I guess, look, more information would be helpful. I'll sit and wait. Yeah.
I could answer that. Nothing's different. All the recommendations are still the same. It's just a priority on the recommendations. So we're not changing. We haven't thrown out that plan at all, because all those FENS still support every single recommendation in that plan. It was just the fire breaks in terms of the cost of them and what we got from them. Yeah, it's just in terms of the cost of the fire breaks to what mitigation they provided was not something that FENS were saying is worth investing, because they can put in their resource on the ground, and they can, and I think there's an example the other day with the fire just down around in Arthur's Point that, you know, they had crews in Wanaka on standby straight away because it's in the red zone and they can react. And so that's where now with our thinking, before we were a standalone landowner where we had to look at what we could do, but now with that partnership, we can partner and say, actually, don't put your money here, let's look at these activities instead.
Look, I'm really pleased that the thinking's evolving, because like I said at the time, you know, it was pretty critical at the time that having big 20-metre swathes of vegetation clearance up Mount Iron was going to look ridiculous, quite frankly. And, you know, so we have to evolve in the treatment. We have to realise what actually makes a difference. Like you said, the 20-metre fire break would have made no difference at OHAL whatsoever. And so we've got to be realistic about what the actual risks we're managing are. And, you know, it's good to see some evolution in this. And I mean, I'm still, as I've said, I still oppose the closures. I don't think they're necessary, but, you know, we're getting to a better place and sort of, and obviously it hasn't affected us this year, so we'll just sort of keep rolling. And
I'm trying to understand.
I mean, as I said, there's 6 million hectares of recreational land on the east coast of Australia, and nobody shuts a gate when it gets hot. You know, it's just like, we've got to be realistic about.
That's simply not true.
Well,
Australia,
not entirely true, but yeah.
no, okay. So Australia has learned lessons over the last 50 years that approach, that historic approach, kills tens of people on average every year, and occasionally hundreds of people. So fire risk index is much more than just the weather conditions. It's the inherent conditions on the ground as well. So you're right, 20 metres isn't sufficient for a fire break. So I think the approach being taken here is moving with that knowledge. And FENS has a statutory responsibility to manage that risk. So they can't just stop putting closures in place, because if they did and people died and property was damaged, they would be liable. So it still has to be there, but it's going to be more effective. But the other thing too, maybe responding
with the closures, it's not to stop property damage. The closures cannot stop property damage, it never will. But anyway, it's
so to answer some of Nikki's concerns, that this approach, because there's a transition happening in all of these pieces of bush anyway, irrespective of what we do, right? There's change happening, there's invasive species, native and introduced. So we've got a responsibility to try and manage that as best we can. And wherever possible, reduce the fire risk within it. So therefore, Nikki, we I sort of take it as it's not a fire risk fighting approach, which New South Wales takes, because they call it threats, whereas here we're taking more of a jiu-jitsu approach and using the energy that's happening in the bush to come up with something that has a better outcome for the natural environment and reduces risk. So I like the sound of this.
Well, as I said, it's evolving in the right direction.
Yeah.
So
I'm just trying to understand your jurisdictional responsibilities and where they overlap or where they butt up against. I think we're taking a very responsible approach based on what you said to the reserves that we manage, but they butt up against dock and lens land, which are tinderboxes, for better or for worse. I'm very aware of some areas around me. And so I'm not sure where our liability is or how we can influence the people who we butt up against, particularly dock and land. I mean, I'll make up a hypothetical example. I start a fire on reserve land, that's our jurisdiction. It goes to dock and land land, and it becomes their jurisdiction. And this is all because of the reorganization that took place in 2023 under FENS,
right? Am I correct? So would you say that if
On reserve land, I'm just making this up. I was involved with the Tenelon Three Chopper fire in 2019. I'm frankly not even sure who took jurisdictional responsibility for its fees. But
it's always fees?
But
It's fees.
it is, yeah.
So
It's
that's
what
what counts
council's
as
chop.
fees.
My concern is that we actually don't have any influence over those who we butt up against. So we're doing the right thing, putting in fire breaks and that sort of thing.
So that's why I mentioned before, really, this is where you're looking to get, but you got to understand your roles and responsibilities. The responsibility of firefighting sits with fees. Doesn't matter what land it lands on, it fits with fees. Other statutory body. So they can put overlays, fire restrictions on any land tenure they like. They can say, no, it's a prohibited fire season. That's how they do it. They can do that over all land tenures. If a fire starts on the land tenure, they're the responsible agency. Landowners can impose extra restrictions on it. Okay. Obviously, you can't go less than the overarching, but you can impose extras. So you often see that in just in informal ways. You might go to a campground in Dockland and it might say no fires. And it might be in an open fire season and they will say no fires, part of the land. We can do that as a landowner. We can say we're in a prohibited season on our reserve at all state, irrespective of the overarching thing. So that's what I mean. That's the difference between the landowner and the statutory. In terms of our reserves, when we say we're looking at what we want the main list to us is we're pushing people, visitors onto our reserves. Okay. So what we're really trying to protect there is the visitors that we push onto our reserves, and that's why we're closing them off to stop those people getting in and putting themselves at risk, particularly at Mount Iron. The topography, if a fire was to get in there from outside the reserve or inside it would travel up there and we'd have a whole lot of visitors and trapped. So that's why we have closed it. It's to really about protecting the people in the reserves. Our role is not to manage fire outside the reserves. That's FEMS's responsibility.
So the closure is not because we're worried about the people starting a fire, it's because we don't want to be in a danger, potentially dangerous.
Yeah, so there's a shift in the air. So it's about, well, we don't want it. We obviously don't want it fires outside, but it's more about protecting our risk inside. In particular here, where we've got a commercial operation with hundreds of people a day, thousands a day. And that's why that's why I call the summer plan, where we work with the community operator, is so important. Okay, because they put a lot of actions in play up there that will protect their visitors in the event of a fire.
Sure, and though if the fire starts in one of our reserves and travels through maybe Lins and Dockland and then hits a residential part of Wanaka in particular, or here, further up the lake, under the Fire and Emergency New Zealand Act, we are liable because it started
so
on
I'm talking
our
about
property, whether
response.
we had anything to do with response.
I'm talking about response.
And the insurance companies will sheet that straight back to us. So we've got a responsibility to do the best we can.
So
Risk.
we're talking two different things here. I was talking about firefighting.
They put the wet stuff on the hot stuff.
Yeah. He's talking about the accountability.
And while we're closing reserves as well, that vegetation, as John mentioned before, is ever changing. It's growing. It's not just a set state. So that's where we've got to look at managing that in terms of, even though it's on Lins and Dockland, what can we do to reduce the risk over time to those users? Yeah. So.
I'll just make a comment. Like 3 years ago, closing the reserves was sort of a blunt instrument because FEMS hadn't really committed to actually giving their proper recommendation and sort of taking the lead. That's what's really changed this whole environment for us, is that they have stepped up and taken the lead and looked at the nuance of a lot of this reserve area, worked with the stakeholders, worked with council, and actually understood the specific issues and also the firefighting ability of these reserves. And just simple things like the GA community in this town and in Wanaka is probably the largest in the country. So our ability to fight with helicopters is marginally a lot bigger than anywhere else, I would say. So just that little nuance alone, they have now taken into account. And that's what shaped our plan, not the fact that we're changing for the sake of changing.
I want to talk really positively about Fins. They've been a really active partner. Okay, I guess you guys are kind of talking about shifting responsibility. I'm more talking about them as a partner. Okay, they've actually partnered that. And they've particularly stepped into that space when we're working with the agent business community up here.
Where have things got to with, because Ziptrek, I was chatting with Trent some time ago, he was concerned about because it's being measured better, that their operation will be shut down. And he was concerned a significant number of days on a dry summer. Is that conversation moved on?
So they're part of their summer plan, the commercial operators have got together. So they have, I can't remember the detail. Do you remember?
Not the numbers, but they're allowed to. So we would shut down mountain biking within the reserve because people are inside the reserve. But because Ziptrek, I think the top towers can still operate, and they've worked with Fins on evacuation, timing them to see, even if you're slow as a person, how long it would take from that tower to get back.
They can manage that.
Yeah, and so Fins are happy with that.
They've actually got a specific plan to get their people back to the
up there. So there's a lot of work has gone into that with the stakeholders.
I think one of the key ones,
the inside.
they had to reduce because they got a 4 and a 6.
Yeah.
So they would stop their 6 and only do the 4, which means they can back.
And then Fins also said they know who's in the reserve and it's controlled, whereas if the reserve was open, you just wouldn't know where anyone was. Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
So what does partner tree removal? What does that mean? They're doing with partner organisations?
Whether it be commercial businesses or the WCG, the Wilding Group, where we can get funding and work together.
So the LTP funding is for removal, and building, but it was for building, but also planting as well. And so there's opportunities out there to actually build.
And constantly various groups emerging in that space as well. It's quite a fast-paced kind of a sector.
Yeah, that's a good way to describe it. They are sort of emerging, and so it's an opportunity to reduce that cost on cancer.
In terms of the environmental monitoring equipment, how's that being used now? Are we actually using it, or have we?
Yes, and we've got 5 around Ben Lomond and 5 around Mount Iron, and that data. So while the cameras are not publicly available, but anyone can log into the Attentis app and look at that data. And if we're still working with Fins, but we're letting the stakeholders in as well to be able to take a look at that data.
Is that used as a decision-making tool though, in terms of closure?
Fins can access it and use it as part of the information gathering. A lot of the indices, specific indices up on that hill, because it gives specific information. They're probably not going to expand the program out any wider. It's probably what we've got is what we'll stay with. Fins has sort of said there's no need. We wouldn't recommend you expanding that program out for these particular reasons, adding more sensors.
Okay.
You don't even put the cameras at the previous camping sites.
Two birds, one stone.
You can point the cameras at the previous camping sites while they're there.
Sorry, that was pretty nervous.
Rabbit hole.
It's a vision sense, sorry. But just going back to that, so we've currently got a whole lot of cameras in, sensors in and around the reserve. Fans have said don't expand that network out with
because they won't use them or use the data, or I'm just
it doesn't probably add any benefit to them.
Good to know.
There is some stuff that identifies hotspots and stuff in there, isn't it? Like it will actually pick up things, early warning, sort of stuff.
Warning detection, so that picks up when a fire's on the reserve.
I think from a fence perspective, what they're saying is, because we were thinking about it just on a standalone in themselves, we thought about expanding the network out. Since Fins has come on part of that change, they're saying don't expand the network because they think about it much wider, and they would say those things would actually be more useful out beyond the reserves. So they're thinking, and so they're saying don't expand it for the reserve.
And there's a lot of data being collected in there, and even like P and I are looking at the rainfall because it's quite localised, you know, the sensors to have a look at that data. And
Well, that'd be interesting for an early seasonal indication of whether it's going to be a dry season or not. I'm sure we've got other avenues of data for that. But it's very localised, these sensors.
Yeah, I guess it gives really localized data. So if you really want to know what's happening up there, then you're probably obviously thinking about it in a much different context. Very good. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to have a little break. 10 minutes. So we
Yep, loud and clear.
Thank you. Okay, kick off then. Yeah. Thanks everybody. Today we'll talk about your second favourite subject, parking. And I'm going to hand over to Tony Picker, I'm sure you'll know.
Thank you, Tony. Yes, good morning. Tony Picker, Strategy Planning Manager for Transport, for those people I haven't worked with yet. Comprehensive Parking Management Plan is a work stream we've been pushing for a couple of years, and today just going to give you a bit of an update on where we are as we come towards hopefully the end of the planning phases and head towards public consultation. The session we have is a few slides, which I'll talk through reasonably quickly. Hope then to dive into some of the mapping and have some more discrete conversations in the set subjects. This presentation, more or less in the same order, has been given to the Wanaka Community Board already and some councillors. So apologies if it's old news to some, but it may be new to others. And hopefully we'll be looking slightly wider than today. We do have a little bit of a technical issue as well, which hopefully is now resolved, but I'd ask you to follow through on your own presentations too, on your own PowerPoints. Purpose of the day, explanation of progress to date, setting some time frame expectations, a sense check of the parking changes and what they mean, particularly if we did them all at the same time. Providing access to mapping, which was shared with you about a week ago, so if you did have time to delve into some of those, you may have seen what we're planning already, and seeking direction for consultation. Are we ready? Are we thereabouts? Are we falling quite short of what your expectations are? Progress to date, the comprehensive parking management work stream comprises a number of documents which we've now amalgamated into one to remove as much of the overlap as possible. A strategy to tell us why we need to do it, a guidelines document to tell us how to do it, and then the first three plans that we've rolled out, which for Queenstown Town Centre, parts of Frankton, and Wanaka Town Centre. This doesn't rule out other parking management plans as we proceed with this work, but at the moment these are the three most affected areas, most impacted by high levels of parking problems. The bundle was completed around September last year, but we've taken advice from our GM very much to concentrate on how this is implemented, the detail level of requirements inside our processes to understand fully what it means before we go out to public consultation. We want to make sure we've got everything squared away before we do that. We're currently finalising to that end an implementation plan by areas, mapping, technology planning, process planning, the systems that need to happen internally, and how we go about that consultation. Consultation has been given a little bit of boost because we might be mirroring what we've just done on speed management. That's similar, that's a detail. Ownership and transport functions. One of the things we've come across fairly early in this is that their transport function, particularly the parking function, is split across a number of teams and departments in council. So for the purposes of this exercise, we've assumed that we are in charge to push through, so we've got one consolidated opinion of what this means. We do understand there is still work going on by a number of other departments at this time, all got different wants and needs in the various departments, which still must continue. So it's really difficult to tie everything down to a point in time because nothing is stopping this development. Parking management has been based on a zone approach within those areas as much as we can, and that's to give as much legibility to our visitors as well as our community, so it's understood. At the moment, there are a number of different restrictions, requirements, even in the same stretch of road, which sometimes leads to a whole load of confusion for the user and also in how they're managed. Management plans will be finalised after public consultation, although we've completed our documents subject to the feedback we've received today, subject to the inputs we get on public consultation. We may have to go back and adjust them until they're complete. In terms of timelines, as I say, we've recently presented to the Wanaka Community Board Council workshop today. We had planned to go to council meeting 7th of May. I don't think we'll be complete by that time, so we may have to push back. The reasons for that are that there are simply more information that we need to consolidate and make sure we've got everything right before we go out to the public. So we may need to push that back. And in terms of making the changes, that depends on having the resources and budgets to do so. So the current aim is at the 2027 LTP, and we'll be pushing this program within that. What's changing? What we've done by looking across the district, looking at our areas which are most impacted by parking, is to work out what we can do to understand the problem first of all, and that's by breaking it down into uses and users. And that gives us a way ahead based on the sort of industry norm of how you manage parking. Parking pricing, parking restriction, timing, and what times we would impose any parking fees are all one of the key tool areas that we've got. And to change that en masse is, as I say, quite a complicated piece. Up till now, it's been on a piece by basis that we've introduced. We've also heard from the community loud and clear. They want to do something different. They want to be recognised. So we've looked at residents and local parking permits and zones, and we'll talk a little bit more about those. They are quite complex. Other areas, service permits in the town centre. We've made a particular zone here. There's some issues to resolve. We've also heard from new parents or those who represent them that we should be more encouraging there in terms of parking facilities. Taxi permits is one which is always attracts a lot of conversation, both for and against. It's very popular with the taxi drivers, the small passenger service vehicle permit holders, and does create a significant amount of work for internal staff. Carpool permits, we've tried 3, 4, 5 years to keep going with very, very little response. So it may be time to move on. Introducing charging parking to areas such as Wanaka, we understand is a significant move. And so at the end of this, hopefully leaving some time to discuss those key points. When and how much do we start to bring in this level of parking management? As an idea of what's changing, a big part of what we do is around permits. There's lots of general public parking, which is quite obvious, but there's a fair amount of permits within our system and more we need to add. And this is where it's been quite difficult to work through, or quite complex to work through with a number of other teams, how we actually go about this. The screening staying the same with those white boxes. The new in yellow service maintenance bays, particularly in Queenstown shared zones or in adjacent to the shared zones. Zone-based resident parking and local resident permits. New parent, car sharing, which is not the same as carpooling. This is where you have typically a commercial company with a number of vehicles stationed in different areas for sharing rather than provide your own.
So just on a side note of that, has anyone been contacted by that guy? Jack's Point, what's his name? Anyway, that rock, is it called Ryan or something?
Yeah. There's been several approaches to today.
So I was approached 2 weeks ago, and he just sort of asking how we could help or whatever. But I mean, they've got a model that works, but they clearly need to promote it. I suppose it's the outcome.
And on to public transport. At the moment, our bus stops are open to all users of large passenger service vehicles, so ski buses, tourism coaches. As the public transport ramps up, we're going to have to start to think about limiting those to stops being public transport permit holders only. Otherwise, we won't have enough room on our key destinations.
it's now the time to ask a question around that.
Please
So
do.
what's our evidence base for saying that the ski bus and things can't pick up and drop off at those places? Are we sort of, is the bus service so frequent that we can't accommodate I think a lot of those people who are on those buses, if they can't get picked up somewhere convenient, will end up either back in the car or something else. So it seems a bit potentially counterintuitive.
So a lot of the discussion came through the Regional Council's public transport business case or public transport services business case, whether they thought it was a problem at this time. They're content that at the moment the key hubs, the exchanges in Frankton and Queenstown are managing, but as those routes may increase, their frequency is going to increase from an hour to 30 minutes to 15 to turn up and go frequencies. So at that point, we'll find that the public transport needs those spaces to be dedicated to. And I think it's having that understanding that the other large passenger service vehicles are going to need somewhere else as well.
There's no barriers in the Transport Act to having different signage for that designation?
No, I mean, it would be under a bus stop class, somebody classed as a vehicle class as a bus, operate in that way, and it's open to all. What we've done previously is identify a permit for when we started on Camp Street. We had a number of stops there. We've done the same for the stops on Stanley Street at the moment. Right, but only those are protected. So as it increases, as fleets increase, so it does the problem.
Right, so there's a small script on the side saying permit holders only. Thank you.
Yeah, and then sorry, just one last one, because I got a handy briefing when I met the coach association a couple of weeks ago, a few weeks ago, and we were talking about there being proposals for them to have places where they can pay to stay overnight, and some of those might be bookable, and which I think was quite attractive. Where would that fall on this chart?
I'll come on to that when I come on to the processes, if I may.
Cool, thank you.
And then just to close these out, the carpooling permit, as I say, we've tried to revamp 7-8 years at a time. Currently, I think it's less than 20 registered users, and we're still allocating spaces to them. So maybe time to do away with that and move on to something else.
Just on that, I think it's an obvious thing, but very physically limited space and lots of competing demands, and there's a sort of a balancing act around that between those various competition, competing needs, and it's a tricky one.
Yeah. Next one then is really about the residence permits, and this is, let's say, we've had a significant amount of feedback on. Difficulty comes down into setting the criteria and the areas to be covered with these type of allowances. There's an expectation from some that a residence permit will automatically allow you to space outside your own property. That's simply not the way it works anywhere that I know of. Our approach is to look at that by zoning the areas and using as many different uses of the space as we can. So the example on the screen there, for example, if you were a visitor to that area, you would be restricted in some way, in this case to 120 minutes in those time limits, but the resident parking holder, resident permit holder would not have to adhere to that. You'd be exempt from that particular restriction.
And the obvious one is in Frankton around the airport, where the people park for a week at a time in the surrounding streets, but this would discourage that, but also allow the residents to still use the streets in front of.
Correct. And it feels like there's like an obvious, well, in this plan it says it has, it's not just about parking, it's about speed management and about the whole transport network. When you talk about zones for residents, I feel like it would be a really great way for people to understand a bit more comprehensively if there was, like residential zones and you have, permit to go into this and they're all at this speed. Then you need to talk about things like zones, like they're mapped in colours and the same with speed limits and the other stuff. Is that front of mind? Is that part of the consideration as we move to something more strategic in this space?
I definitely think if we're allocating zones, then we need to sign them correctly. to identify that, not just to the residents themselves, but to visitors.
Of course, but I guess it's the comprehension and there is always a limitation with enforcement, and a rule that's not enforced is a suggestion. And so with parking, the NMP show, no one gets ticketed, but everyone parks like a lunatic. And so the point is that as soon as you see one person do something wrong and not getting in trouble for it, then everybody does it. So part of the strategy could be understanding the rules, having very clear guidelines, and people actually listen to them. Part of that is creating good, accessible, understandable, zones and structures that people go, I'm going into this residential zone. Now I need this permit if I'm going to park overnight. Now the speed's 40 k's an hour. Now this, having that level of consistency so that there's good comprehension built from the drivers. I know it's sort of in the language when we're talking about these reports, but I just think there's a huge part to being a driver and knowing exactly where I'm at and understanding sort of the rules, because it's, based on what everyone else is doing.
Isn't it a situation where you understanding that you go and there's a sign, you've just gone past the sign, if you didn't read the sign, that's kind of your problem?
It's like I don't drive down the street and read every sign as I'm driving. And often people remember things as well. To the point of just there's a language around communication, and not always is it written down. A lot of it's visual, a lot of it's learned and all the other stuff. So I guess the easier that you can make it for people to understand, the better compliance we get.
Going back to
I think you're right, Cody.
Quentin's point, you learn pretty quickly when you park for too long in Frankton and get a ticket.
Yeah.
I did.
But people get most frustrated when there's no consistency. People get annoyed when obviously you park there and you thought it was okay, but there's all these different little, there's something particular about this road at this time and whatever else. So I guess to that point, whereas that's anyway.
I think consistency of messaging and zoning is critical, and we know that more variation, more difficult it is to comply with. The interesting about residence permits and the next permits that Tony talked about is it also this requires a technology solution to being able to identify locals versus tourist number plate recognition systems. And we need to be cautious about the ones we take to set that system up, because it does rely heavily on that in this system. So
therefore, if we're talking about residential areas with visitor accommodation, they can't just give that to their guest for the week they're there or whatever.
The intention would be that you're pre-registering
or actual residents, not the residential property. Gotcha.
it also depends on what sort of area is zoned like this.
Yeah.
I don't think we're suggesting this is every residential zone in the district. Would be those high use areas. And you raise an interesting point. There are a lot of Airbnbs around the district. This, Frankton Airport area is a sort of a classic one, but whether you'd apply it for maybe at the hill some areas. So the limits on that are also a critical component of whether you apply something like this.
Yep.
Enforceability becomes quite difficult as well.
I think there's Cody's raised a few times the differential pricing thing. I think is quite valuable here. And I know this is a broader question, but we, and I've used the example in Sydney a few times that the residents of the Northern Beaches did have a resident sticker. In those days, it was pretty old school. And they could buy a second sticker for their house to be allowed to park at the beaches, but being able to access, having a benefit for living here or to being a resident here above and beyond what the visitors is actually a really valuable story for us. And I know it's a bigger piece of work, but if, Wanaka residents could we're allowed to park on the Wanaka lakefront, but the visitors had to, we're in a charge zone or something, I'm fine with that, It's actually a really good story.
As long as there's space to do all that.
Totally. But that's the whole point of these tools, is that it allows you to provide the space, it opens up space.
I'm going to look through the whole question of differential pricing is a critical one. The technology needs around that,
Well, that was fine. KB, if I understand.
We propose on this slide, isn't it? It's differential pricing.
Yeah, we're going to
But in a focus zone, not at a broad level. But I think, you know, what I've heard before is that the biggest barrier is not so much being able to have someone drive past and associate a number plate with a property, but actually all the data issues associated with that in the background is we end up being the holder of all this data that we currently aren't, you know, like car ownership and all that sort of stuff.
It is a real issue. Should we look through,
Just to clarify, sorry, that last one, so where it says half price to parking in other paid areas, so McBride Street might be a residence control zone, but you can get half price down in Mount Street car park, or that's,
Yeah.
yeah, cool. Thank you.
There's an extra give back.
Yeah.
again, we've got the big technology issue to sort there first. Yes.
And just to follow that on, the resident permits give you exemption to fees and time restrictions within that zone and the half time or that discount in other areas. Also, for those people who don't live or a community that doesn't live in a particular residence zone, the locals permit is a similar thing, but that entitles you to the discounted parking as well, because we're trying to encourage that use in the areas to a point, not all day free parking, but to a point we're still encouraging that.
So just on that technology base, so I mean, clearly the technology's out there. I mean, you could go to market and find a solution to this. So is this primarily a money and a resource issue as to do we invest in this solution, or is there a fundamental opposition to going down that road, or is there something else that's limiting us going down there? Because the market can provide it, I've got no doubt.
I think we're going to need to come back with a clear business case around there, and privacy issues are significant. We know the government's also talking about potentially changing the whole people taxation system to a universal type of rate, which will also require some kind of registration of bits and pieces. We know that plate recognition is very viable in doing that. It's that linking back to some database which allows differentiation, which we can significantly and just building the technology.
Correct me if I'm wrong here, but the financial cost is not enormous. It's not a huge investment. It's partly, it's the culture.
It'd be substantial, but we don't ignore that, but it would be just potentially justified. There's potentially a case for it.
It's the cultural consideration, I think.
What do you think it's in our practice? I'm pretty sure under dozens.
Just whenever you start collecting data around this sort of stuff, you start tracking vehicle movements. What are the rules around that? I mean, they're not solvable.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'm not an expert, but we need to be able to register. Personally, I'm not entirely sure about the last point here. A letter of permission from the owner could be very wide on that one. But we know we've got some houses which have 2, 3, 4 vehicles associated with them, so how do you differentiate? I think it's more the privacy of people being tracked in terms of movements and other things.
Yeah.
But parking enforcement increasingly moving to another type systems would then be a differentiation between those who are local and everybody else.
Yeah. And you'd have to be able to register unregistered vehicles to your resident and all that sort of stuff.
Would you envisage that being managed in-house versus, because there's companies that do this now?
And we've been talking to some of those companies for that reason, and the question that arises, is it something we buy in-house and set up resource, or is it something we buy in as a service? So that's the same with a lot of technology-based approaches. Is it something we need? Same as CCTV, do we manage that ourselves or do we outsource?
That's a big job managing it in-house, isn't it?
Just have a good procurement process in place.
And presumably, if we're talking about Frankton Road and demand management and congestion charging, that's exactly the same technology. Yes. So we would need to make sure, I mean, you wouldn't have one system for parking and one system for Frankton Road. I mean, it has to be integrated and yeah.
I'm 2 slides away from explaining that.
I think the first one, because we also talked about Councillor Smith's favourite of charging at boat ramps, the ability to be able to differentiate those sort of things across the board. It's backbone of the type system, or which a whole lot of things might come off it.
Let's start there.
Hey, I'm going to have to go. I'm going to want to the protection and action plan. I'm entirely confident you'll deal with everything. I think Nikki and Q have got some issues around the CEO recruitment process that I've shared.
I have that.
You can watch it online later.
Just to point out that all this background work we've been doing has resulted in some quite lengthy documents, which we decided a few months back to put these out to the public for consultation on that. It's not going to be an easy read. Far better to produce that in a format which is interactive and clear on how it affects you, similar to the process that's been done for the speed management. It's a map-based consultation. We're working through that now on how to make that easier. Once we finish this presentation, we'll dive into some of that, and hopefully some of you did find the time to sort of drill down into some of those. It is on a zone-based area. We're trying to make it as legible as possible. For the 3 different areas we focused on have completely different needs to some extent. So it's trying to make one system to cover them all. We are aware not everybody wants to use technology either. We're serving the majority as best we can. Onto the processes. We found by working across council with our GIS teams, with our knowledge management teams, there's a whole load of work that needs to be understood, how we make this happen in the background. From somebody coming to the counter and getting a paper permit, producing documents and being issued something physical to go stick in their car windscreen, with the number of complex permits, with the information we need to gather from technology, there's a whole range of questions that we need to ask. We're now at the point where we're coming around to understanding what that question is. I'm learning terms like middleware, which I've never understood, but that's the bit in the middle which joins all these things together. It can replace our need to send people out for monitoring. It can work with fixed and mobile cameras. It can give us information on levels of occupancy. It gives us a better understanding of those dynamic pricing systems when we want to use them. Hopefully we can link it into time of use charging should we impose that as well. So it really is, as Tony was saying, the need to get that technology first. And also that decision, that commercial decision, is it a service we pay for or is it a resource we have in-house? And that's a key bit of work. At the moment, there isn't the budget for it. So that's why we're pushing towards the next LTP.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a really quick one on that. I'm just aware that there's so much stuff we can do in this space, but we've also got this ability, as we should have, for customers to come and dispute the tickets that they're granted. Just want to make sure as we go forward that we sense check this and understand, you know, is the technology driving us towards fairer, lower cost systems or potentially more unfair, higher cost systems to manage? They might look more simple, but the after impacts may be more costly and more difficult, I guess. Just a statement, because I think it looks good, but sometimes the tech doesn't ultimately help us or deliver savings. Thanks.
And just hopefully a level of comfort on that by engaging with all our internal teams, we'll make sure that all those functions are incorporated.
And I think just to speak to that a little bit is, you know, remember the focus of this isn't revenue gathering, or it's to make the place will function better and to work better. It's about making, you know, so it's the outcome we want. And going to Cody's point, you want it to be fairly seamless in how it functions. So, you know, being able to use technology to your advantage to make it easier, not harder. You know, you now don't have to go back to your car to put a ticket back in the window. You've just got the number plate plugged in. You now don't have to worry about going to the council office to buy your ramp fees, ticket at the beginning, and put a sticker on your motor. You just buy it online and you're done. You know, so there's a yeah. I mean, I think the opportunity is to be seamless, not to be complicated. You know,
but also to be equitable.
Not totally, but the equity comes from being able, you know, customers being able to access shops and not for the workers to be parking out in front of their shops. And you know, there's a whole bunch of equity that this creates, the opportunities it creates, you know.
Sorry,
Put the
I
right
was
things
just
on
being,
paper.
I was just being more specific in terms of the enforcement and the parking and the ticketing side of things. That needs to be equitable because not everybody has access to technology.
I think one of the frustrations I hear quite a bit from the public is the fact that we have the rules, but the enforcement isn't followed up. Yeah, and to your point there, we've got some businesses that are parking way over their limit, and I'm sure you've probably heard these ones. But the enforcement isn't there to actually discourage them from doing what they should be doing, or not doing what they should be doing.
With enforcement, often can't win either way.
No.
It's like the two zealous or doesn't enforce enough.
No.
Exactly. Whereas this system,
Yeah.
there's no discretion. It's just break the rules.
Yeah, I think that's the big point.
Do you have like an indicative cost of how much the technology would cost? And no.
I don't know.
Very much work in progress. We understand that the total cost of this per year ranging in the sort of 500,000 million a year to get underway, and that's ignoring the cost of signage and the like. That would come from additional staff resources, but also the technology. And again, last time we looked at a license plate recognition car 3 or 4 years ago. To buy the car and the technology and the backroom setup was about 70,000. That will have gone up significantly by now, but it's not a high level of cost.
And comparatively to what the revenue that we generate from parking fines or fines at the moment, is it?
So parking fines are set nationally. Nothing comes to us from those. Parking charges we can recycle through council, and the parking fees that come in, if it's on a reserve, can go back to the reserve. If parking is in one.
On the fines,
Yeah, we keep the fines. We don't set the amount that's set nationally, but we keep.
yeah, we just need to.
There's at a high level, so there's two sides of it. There's the revenue we get from parking fees, and then there's the fines. Now, the parking fees, those are all the ones. So there's two sides to that. One is that it's a TDM, or traffic demand management. You're actually using it as a tool to drive people onto public transport, which was the whole principle of the TDM case in Queenstown. But at the time, that money was also going back to subsidising the public transport facilities and services, which it's not anymore. So there's a cause and effect. You can actually use that money to support something else. And then the other side is the fines we usually more than wash our face with what we use for enforcement is paid for by the fines that are issued and then some.
That's kind of what I'm wondering, with the new technology wash its face.
Right, it should more than, I would say, collectively it should more than. And as I said, and I hate to use the example, I'm not promoting we paid for boat ramp. I just, it's such a, but it is such an obvious example of where we're under recovering something where we can,
So why can't we just get the budget for it, because it's going to pay for itself?
Exactly. And this has been my argument, is that when we're recovering less than 5% of grant fee, surely some sort of enforcement system will increase recovery, increase the revenue, pay for itself, and increase the revenue that we can.
I don't see it's I'm not saying that it's a budget constraint, but I know I'm not.
And to your point, all they need to do is put a bloody parking meter there to win up 900%. So people are not willing to pay.
I'm just wondering whether we should try and look through the rest and ask other things to get on with.
Talking about parking, Tony, how many,
I'd
like to know how many years, what kind of a jump that would give us, that $500,000 investment. And when I ask that, what I mean is a little bit of a blue sky question. In your model you have, or rather later on you say that our population will be 198,000, I think, by 2050. I think that's actually a little bit short. It'll probably be closer to 250,000. All right, so if you start that 250,000, and I'm sure you've got lots of comps and people you liaise with around the world, and you model the parking for 250,000 people, it looks a certain way, and it's much more restrictive than it is now. And we accept that. So we get there by increments. And what I'm wondering is 500,000, what kind of an increment would that get us? or if you could be God and impose your $250,000 parking model right now, what would it look like? And then if you went backwards, what would it look like? And if we wanted to get it 10 years into the future, of course, people would scream, how much would that cost? What would that look like? Does this make any sense?
Yes, it does. It's about when to invest. We're already behind, and the different areas have different.
How many years are we behind, do you think? Just go on.
I think in Queenstown, we allowed through our master planning of the town centre to add 1,100 public off-road spaces. We haven't done that. So we are.
That's a different question. I think
years. Can you express it in years or numbers of parking spaces?
I'm not sure the question.
Make it up 2 years.
But we've got a very limited,
1,600.
physically limited space. I think what Tony's referring to is council previously looked at building off-street car parks to provide additional capacity. That's a different question completely. In terms of the physical, we've got very limited physical space. So I'm unsure what your question is. We can improve our enforcement by using technology, which, that might, we'll find that it's still a physically limited space, and then it becomes how do we allocate that space? And when you'll recall around the debates around building off-street car parks and the economics of that, there's a number of proposals there.
The other thing, and I remember this from a smart city type thing, was that, if we go back 5 or 10 years, the idea would have been sensors in the ground and have some sort of like directing people to empty spots, basically. And also, when if there was a car more than 2 hours, then it would signal to the person to come and write a ticket. Now, we've got miles ahead of that already. Google's way smarter than that already. Is that, if you're driving down Stanley Street, by the time you get to that park that's empty over there, it's going to be full. So it already knows where the most likely place for you to get a park is before it even happens. And, so there's all this predictive technology that's already in play, that's already jumped that stuff. You don't even need to know whether there's someone in that car park, because there's a scooter that drives past and there's cameras that, no, instantly.
From like a morality point of view, the people who will be the most upset are the ones who are used to abusing the system. And then if they're saying then, well, it's not fair enough that the rules aren't working, well, then let's change the rules. So it's like, but I guess it's more accountability to it. Yeah, I think we'll move on.
Quickly, but sort of messages we're behind.
I think this represents a step change, it's fair to say. But in terms of the time behind it, we've also had some changing government direction around this as well, which will have impacted the decisions that have been made and the funding that's been put in by NZTA to all these kind of ancillary parts. We're not in this alone. There is the ORC component, there is the NZTA component. So it is really hard to say exactly how far behind, but I think it is fair to say this represents a step change.
It's worth referring back to the work we did before, back into 2017, when the change to all bus came. And we stripped out all the sort of longer term parking in the town centre, and we tied that in $2 fare with a new bus service. The change in patronage to Big T was 236%. There's a significant step change at that time. At the moment, public transport increasing, fuel price going up. We make a change here in parking. We just need to consider what everybody does still to get to work and to shopping and to wherever they need to go.
Really need to bring you to 51 people to do us, so we get a sheet to lead with.
Yes.
So,
key topics by area. I'm just looking at the first interventions we might see. Wanaka will be a change to far more widespread time restrictions and parking charges. Frankton will be around time restrictions and residence permits. Residence permits coming in Wanaka in later phases. Also then into Queenstown, which we'll look at the mapping in a moment. Quite a lot of things to discuss. Time restrictions, evening parking, do we balance that out with what the visitor needs, what the businesses needs, parking charges and the levels of those, the level of parking and the complexity of them, parking permits, small passenger service vehicles, taxis, how do we continue to manage them? We're the only place in the country that does. Residence permits, and particularly I want to look at Park Street and the Lake Esplanade around Queenstown. So if it's okay, I'll just want to jump into some of the mapping, if I can make the technology work. Come out, please.
Done its own thing. Many teams.
Here we are. This is the information that was shared about a week ago, and this just enables us to sort of dive down into the various areas. There's a little bit more detail on the version I have to show some of the background information, but I did want to go just through the three various zones and then just have some set discussions about those key points. If I start off, just give you a quick overview. What it would look like in terms of the area we intend to manage. And you will see that we split up all color coded, purple for where there is a proposed change, red for where we're going to remove something, and blue is parking. You'll also see that there are various different zones that we've attached here, and that information comes up. This is one of the things we're trying to work through the consultation. How much information do we put out so people can actually zoom into their street, their business, and make that change and see clearly what the change is. For the zones, in this case for Fringe B, what do we do first of all, and what do we do at a later stage? That could be 12 months, that could be a 3-year time frame to join in with the LTT cycles. As we move in, lots of complexities on this. Take something like Ardmore Street. Next to Pembroke Park is road. On the other side is Park Road, Park Reserve. So we have to treat those areas slightly differently as well, to make sure we're dealing with all the users. You see it's fairly broad, fairly tightly brought in and around the town centre, with a number of proposals in there. But a lot of it is it's in the blue zone or in the blue markers, so they're existing to some extent. I'll come back into those in a moment. Frankton, mainly the residential side of Frankton. This is where we've got the 48-hour parking, when we took all the parking off the state highway because it was people abandoning their cars for free airport parking. Some years ago, we took that back to 48 hours. And this is mainly changes from that 48 hours into residential zones, and a couple of changes requested by the community. I think the lines down the bottom there, these P180s, where residents, it says people are parking for employment or for the high school. Again, would impose some constraints. Also jumping into the far more complex Queenstown, much bigger zone. 5,500 spaces, public and private, to try and work out all those various different user groups, how they all fit in, and how we make it legible. We have put it into zones, and hopefully within a zone, we've got a set of rules within the parking management plans. We'll treat as much consistently as we can, so it is legible for both the locals and the visitors. But there are some areas in here we still need to work on. We know, for example, I'll dive into these key areas now, Lake Esplanade and Park Street particularly amount for a huge amount of our free commuter parking at this time. These have basically become on-street car parks because of the amount of use, both affected recently by the freedom camping, so they still have a bit of a hangover restriction on there about overnight parking, which we may seek to remove. We'll look particularly heading back as we've done through this work. We've been out on the ground trying to understand what's there as well as what's in our system. Park Street only has 2 parking bays. There are 2 large indented bays, and that's all it was originally set up to accommodate. The whole of the street has become that parking area, and that's on both sides as well. How far would we go in removing our main free parking areas, like Esplanade and Park Street? So it's a matter of, we've mapped all the areas, we've made recommendations as to what we might do with them. But I guess the key question here is how much and how quickly should we start to make those changes? Everything at once, if we had the technology in place, would be a significant change. Or do we introduce some of the time restrictions first before the paid parking, and how far and how strict do we need to be? What we've given you, as I say, is the task we were given, which was how to manage in Queenstown Town Centre without those off-work spaces, and this is the option we have. Bearing in mind that there are still lots of interim parking spaces, Stanley Street and Lakeview, which are on development sites in the public domain. There are also private parking around, which are on potential development sites that may disappear at some stage. So understanding if we've got the balance right, if we were to move ahead with all these changes at the same time, or should we have a slower implementation? So hopefully just a bit of an overview of the extent of the areas we've covered by the 3 different zones, and really now keen to understand, to get some direction on how quickly, budgets and resourcing allowing, should we push with the interventions. Nikki.
I just, on that question, I think you kind of need to go back to the principles and the strategy, and one of them is equity. And you've noted the small communities, which I'm really grateful for, and the fact that some people just need to travel and that there's no public transport. I think that needs to come into it here. I think if you go hard and you strip out too much, how do those people who have to drive get on without there being public transport? Unless you're going to at the same time supplement it with special permits from people, for people who live outside in those smaller communities but commute into work. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Points should be pretty clear, I think, but ask for clarification if you need to.
Alyssa?
I had a few questions. I don't know if it's answering your exact question, but let's start. Where there's time, or did you want to just talk about late Easter? Can I just anything? Okay. So you're asking us, but this is going out for consultation?
We're preparing for consultation.
Okay.
Trying to gather various different internal feedback. We have public input, but before we go out for the last sort of finalised consultation, we're really keen to hear from this group.
Oh, okay, all right. So I'm not as concerned with what's in there, you know, taking on board what other people have said, but as long as this is seen as consultation, and then we can take that feedback on board type thing. But a couple of questions just in terms of some of the changes that are proposed, and the document's actually really good and easy to, you know, it is easy to work in. But when you go into, so let's say, for example, Queenstown, there's a few around the night and day that removal, it would be really useful during the consultation. And I don't know if we can do it for all of them, like, so there's either removal or changes. It'd be good to have a reason why they're being changed, or why we're proposing. And I think that would really, because otherwise I think we'll have a lot of people say, no, don't get rid of that. Whereas if they could just read the reasons why we're doing this is to, like, flow, or whatever the reasons are, and specifically when I look at some of the changes around Earl Street Marine Parade changing from 2 hours to 190, like, why is the reason that we're doing that? The same with we had paid parking till 9, we took the parking away, now we're proposing to put it back in. Why are we doing that? And there could be good, you know, there's likely to be reasons. So I think if we had the reason that the change is proposed, that would help people. Otherwise, we'll just get all this feedback saying, don't do that. Does that make sense?
It does.
And I don't know if it's possible or not.
For example, on Camp Street by the night and day there, we've got definitely opposing views, even from within the taxi drivers themselves. Yeah. Some want to keep wherever it is, some want to move further along Camp Street, want to change those spaces outside the night day so go on the other side of the road. Yeah. And so everything we've got here is going to be different views on it. Yeah. So even if we explain why we're intending to do it, it'll be the view of maybe we'll have to express those different views. We've got some party that say we should change it to do this, to have less time restriction, but longer taxi ranks, for example. Yeah. And others will say, no, keep it the same as it is. So it's that sort of toss-up when we put out the consultation material to say why we're making those changes. It's in response to public feedback in response to our own surveys and understanding of how the area is being used, and trying to accommodate multiple user groups at the same time.
Yeah.
If that's something we can include.
Yeah, I mean, even if what did you just say, in response to user groups, or, you know, like, to me, that is a good, that is a fair excuse of why we're proposing the change, if that makes sense.
I made a similar comment in Monica the other day, just trying to understand the methodology behind different things, and I agree we've got to be able to justify and answer why we're changing something, particularly, you know, I made the point that each of these people have a different, each of these parks have a different user group or a different reason why, and, you know, the one in front of the chemist, they want to be able to drop in for 10 minutes and get their script and go, and for, you know, someone else, it's, you know, they want to be able to have an hour and a half for lunch, you know, so you've got to understand the user group, the reason people are there, and enable them, I suppose. And, I mean, I mean, one of the things that's really clear for here is that it's quite complicated and there's a lot of detail, and, you know, so each of us will know different areas better. I'm sure you'll know Brecon Street better than me, and I'll know parts of Wanaka better than you. So, you know, I suppose encourage you each to have a look at the detail of where the areas that you know, because I don't think any of us can cover all of it, quite frankly. And, you know, when we did it with the community board, I've still got to go through and make some notes on the ones in Wanaka, and sort of, I'm not sure whether any changes that were made as a result of the feedback from the community board, or
not as yet. Not as still taking in that feedback, as we'll take in feedback from this section. For the next couple of weeks as well.
So I've still got to go back through and make some notes around what's happening in Wanaka, and hopefully you guys can do the same here, just to try and answer some of those questions. Some of the things were obvious to me that needed adjusting, and others less.
I think that's a really good approach, Quentin. One thing I also would urge is that look at the give back component of the locals permit, and how that balances off against some of the restrictions that are in here. You kind of got to keep that in mind. I think it's currently proposed for 3 hours. If you're taking away free commuter parking, for example, you might want to think about how those things intersect.
So it's,
is that what's proposed for Park Street, is to remove the ability for day parking?
To some extent, yes. I mean, Park Street has been muted. It's really one of our key active travel routes as well. And currently, by allowing parking on both sides, you made it quite a dangerous street to travel on. So removing a lot of that commuter parking there, yes, it will free up the space. It will have a dual use, some parking, but also other modes as well.
A couple of thoughts. The reason that this is so specific is I keep saying to the team, we need to be able to get down to the street sort of level around what the changes are proposed, so it's very, very clear. Bold prediction, all of these proposals will generate a lot of quite differing reactions to it, depending on whether you're a shop owner or a commuter or something else. And there's always consequences. So if we remove all the commuter parking, it's like a bubble, so a balloon full of water. You squeeze it and it's going to pop out somewhere else. It has to go somewhere, either onto buses or other options. So it's a very, very limited space physically. And so it's a bit like exercising the judgment of the consultant around some of this stuff. You know, you're not going to satisfy everybody, but what's the best allocation of the space between all those different competing demands?
And I suppose that's why we've pushed over the years for a comprehensive approach to it, because, you know, that each of those decisions that we were making had a cause and effect that we didn't quite understand, you know. So, that's one of the things we need to still.
I know that at the moment in town here, pay parking limit stops at 6. We could extend it, but we know that when it was reduced, there was a real reaction from businesses around the need to support businesses at that time of the night. We also know that at that time there's a lot of tourists that end up in town. So how do you, those sort of competing demands that you try and work through?
In order to help with feedback and suggestions, I think, you know, parking is the easiest thing to get feedback from once you've done it. So, like, if there are restrictions for Local Government Act as to the level of consultation that we need in order to propose these changes that prohibit us from going, we'll say to the community, like, we're going to try some parking things. and then they'll all go around and go, cool, that doesn't work, and then they'll all give us feedback, and then we can adjust. Or is that just not, from a framework point of view, able to do in the local government?
I can't answer that off the top of my head without going back and reading through it. I think it's significant enough if we were to make all these changes at the same time. That's the level of public interest that we should go out to that level. I think we made a lot of trials in Queenstown Town Centre. We did some in Wanaka for a short amount of time as well. And by the time we'd received all that feedback, something else had changed on the ground as well. So not keen to go into specific individual trials. I think we should have.
It's not necessarily what I'm referring to. It's more that, like, I think there's a lot of work that's done here, and a lot of, like, it's all great. And I think that last 5 or 10% we'll hear about pretty quickly, and then go, maybe we can adjust that to meet the demands. I guess the point is trying to think of every possible scenario from a desktop exercise is quite difficult. Do you have the scope to be flexible with adaptation after the fact, or is that something that's mandated through the?
Absolutely. And I think one of these things, imagine we're a year from now, we have the technology in place, the camera cars are going around, the fixed cameras are giving us this level of occupancy information. We'll understand how these places are being used. This is underused, this is overused, this is above 80, 85% full. So we need to increase the price on that one, or lower it on this one, which is empty.
Yeah.
So definitely there's a scope to make that change, but it needs to be not individual spaces. So yes.
That would help me dictate the direction I give you to go. I'd be more inclined to say, we're doing the changes, do as much as you can. And then, I don't know. For me, I feel like
just a poll action, right? Any change will generate a lot of reaction.
That's sort of why I wanted to.
But and then making a change to get reaction will generate a different reaction.
I mean,
this is the experience of parking changes, and why I've driven the team quite hard to get to this level of detail from past experience around the heat that this sort of generates. And you're not going to. It's a really difficult, moderating decision balancing around how do we provide between those very competing demands for a very limited physical space.
I appreciate that. I think if you look at the US political strategy, it's all about scatter and just throw crazy information all at once, and then suddenly people can't really focus on anything in particular. So, and I mean, we had so much pushback around the rocks that got put on near the waterfall, the car park, the tree, and then later in Wanaka. And it was abhorrent, the pushback, but now that it's there, everyone's parking more considerately. And so the point is you'll get that regardless. And if you stage it out, you're going to get a hell of a lot of feedback over a hell of a long time that's all painful and all ultimately not helpful because it's not in the best interest anyway. So might as well. Anyway, that's my point.
I think you made me the point that you highlight the fact that this is going to be politically a tough thing to put into play. So the more you can do it based on good strategy, clear thinking, logic, and some detail, and then further down the track as we're reviewing things, the traffic and parking bylaw would allow for minor changes to be made as we go forward anyway. So there are mechanisms to repair if there are things that were not quite right. But yeah, it's going to take some political metal, I think.
So your ask is, how fast do we want to go?
Looking for direction on that, representing the community. I mean, we've had a lot of feedback here. Yeah, we're well aware that this is, as we're talking about, quite emotional. Even with our internal teams, it's been difficult to separate out what's personal view versus the business. So it's, we understand there's going to be a big reaction, but we understand how do we implement it that is equitable, if you like, to everybody out there. It's difficult to ask the visitors, but we can certainly understand from the community.
From my perspective, there's significant evidence that the infrastructure is at its capacity, and so change is needed. But I think we've probably been quite soft, I guess, in making that change and creating that friction. And back to Cody's point, you're going to piss someone off regardless. And there's a bold political sort of position we have to take in order to solve some of these problems that we're facing. So from my perspective anyway, as long as we are fair with the enforcement, then I don't see a problem with it. And as I said, if we want to create mode shift, we're not going to do it unless we create friction first. And you just drive along Franklin Road and you see the amount of cars that have only got one person sitting in them. And that's not going to change unless we create friction. So I guess time to be bold, and if I don't want to stay next time, I'm not going to go down.
Nikki.
Oh, thanks. Sorry, this was outside of the question. It's just some really quick feedback. I've chucked it in the chat. Can we change new mum and make sure that it's new parent? I just think that's really important when we go out.
It was in the document.
Just search new mum or new and it'll. The other thing was just, is to sort of Cody's point, is this a chance to kind of go out, since we're consulting about parking and when we're seeking feedback from people, ask them where they do park and why they park there, and do they have transport choices, and if not, why not? Could we gather some more information to help our decision making as a part of the consultation?
Well, potentially, but it would be quite a significant process. We need to carefully design and would have a cost to that. So we could.
It's just about, to me, it's about understanding that question that you've asked about transport equity. And it is one of the principles in the strategy, and I think we need to apply it. I agree with Matt that we need to create the tension, but as the strategy says, we need to find out what the individual needs are. Everybody has different needs, and we want to focus on those providing parking for those priority users that have needs that can't be met by other modes.
I think
so. How do we get the information that we need?
I think we also might have some legacy information on that could be helpful from previous quality of life surveys. We have actually asked some of those questions. May not be current enough, but my memory can't.
So back to the how fast question. Oh, so last thing I'll say is just go back to we can't act fast in opposition to the principles that you've put right through that strategy, which are really good, which recognise the different needs of different users. So we need to go fast on those things at the same time as going hard and fast on the parking changes. Thanks.
Ask a couple of questions. With the free commuter parking, on Park Street and the Esplanade. I mean, some of those people, coming back to what Nikki was saying, some of those people will have a choice that they could get a bus. If we were looking at the people that commuting maybe from Kingston, or well, I suppose they can start to Frankston and get a bus, but from Glenelg or elsewhere that don't really have another choice. If we took away the free commuter parking, is there sufficient capacity for paid parking for them still to have a choice? Because I think that's probably quite fundamental. That if we know there isn't enough room in Man Street or Church Street or wherever else to accommodate these people that we would displace, then we've got a problem. Otherwise, we don't have a problem. It's just a choice as to what people decide. Because should there be an expectation that just because you live in Glenorchy, there should be somewhere free for you to park on the street? Anyway,
it's more of if you're a commuter and you're used to parking in Park Street. And we're taking that option away, but then there's no ability to park anywhere else for 12 hours because you've got a 12-hour workday.
Yes.
And you're really depicting those people.
Yeah, unless there is someone that can pay for park.
And for 12 hours.
So I'll just follow up one more because I think it's relevant to that taxi rank thing. So, we're in a gig economy where most of the Ubers and whatever are just floating around. They don't sit on ranks. The chamber would say our visitors from overseas like a taxi rank because it's something they recognise. How do we balance that? Because there is a lot of space, but there's quite a significant number of spaces taken up by permitted taxis,
and they're a nightmare to be fair.
So because that's one of the questions here: is do we keep that, yes or not? How do you want us to give you direction on that, or you just want to see what comes out of the consultation?
I'm really keen to understand whether it's something we should still be promoting. It's us alone. There's been various positive outcomes from it, and police particularly were very positive about the scheme itself. We don't regulate all aspects of that industry. Some are NZTA, some are elsewhere, but it's offering something from the purely transport perspective. It's offering somewhere which is identifiable as a taxi rank, so that people know where to go to get the vehicle and get away. And the advantage of that is that we encourage those places to form. Taxis don't have to stop in a rank. They can stop in a loading bay, they can stop in the middle of the road as long as it's not interfering with other traffic. Ubers and the like have different rules as well. We don't control every aspect of this. We're facilitating something which works and is popular with the users. So is it still worth the number of permits that have to be processed, the difficulties with passing or transferring or selling on the permits themselves, the difference between somebody who's permitted who's not, and who gets priority in those spaces, and they are limited, then are they in the right places? Do we need to move them? But do we still, because there are different user groups, allowing some Uber spaces next to the paid permit? Does it start to get too complicated?
Do we have an option in this strategy of having a taxi, whatever you call it, a set down pickup point, but not a rank? So they're identified. So, and the example would be, Wellington, you walk outside to Papa, and it's a place and it's got, here's the number for the taxis, you phone and somebody will come to you. And whether that's Uber through your phone or phoning Blue Bubble on from the side. So you don't have places occupied by vehicles waiting, but you have places where the customer know they can go to, but the vehicle can go there.
Yeah, it feels a little bit old school, except at the airport these days. But anyway, I'm all worked through it.
I think we have places in Queen's downtown centre for those Uber type vehicles as well as the formed ranks. That's something we can definitely include here. Whether we get enough strength on feedback for that.
I mean, the taxi industry used to be heavily self-regulating because it was, was heavily regulated, and they fought really hard for. But the deregulations just annihilated all that. That's why we get it assaulted. The issues in Wanaka over New Year's and all that stuff because they.
I think the only reason that this counts as SPVs were the only counts does is because of the deregulation. And call made by taxi ranks that we need to do something to try and manage that. Whether we have taxi ranks or other dedicated spots, they're still spots dedicated to the SPV permits. In a crude sense, is about allocating a certain number of those permits to those who can use those taxi ranks. We now know that the SPVs have a significant commercial value because of what they ascribe to them. Whether they're actually providing a service or not is an open question. Just one other thought I did have around the commuting, this is a sort of broader implication. Potentially, we're seeing the CBD here becoming increasingly a tourism destination, not a residential, location to go. Potentially, removing the commuter parking might, of course, drive more people to Frankton area or Markets Park area, where there's actually more free, unrestricted parking, businesses and those sorts of things. So you can start to have unintended consequences by some of these changes because people simply can't come into town here, find a park. So businesses might relocate to other areas where there's free parking. Those are sort of some of the broader implications around some of this. It's never easy. And personally, I think there will need to be a mix between all-day commuter parking and time-restricted parking to reflect a very sensitive question of where and how do you provide for that. And picking up on Danny's proposal, how do you treat people in more like Glenorchy or Luggett or elsewhere, or dare I say even Bannockburn or Cromwell commuting through, differently from people that are like Hayes or Jackson Point or somewhere else. Those also raise quite significant questions around a very limited space. So again, everything has a consequence, and you make a change one spot, it'll have a consequence somewhere else. Some people will like it, some people will hate it. It's a really broad area.
If you take like a city like Wellington, for example, what do workers do there? Do they find free spaces or do they pay for daily rates?
No idea. They've actually got red public transport charges, but I don't know. Sorry.
I think that's what I was saying before that in Queenstown it's different because it's a lever to get people on the buses in some ways, and we're providing a very expensive bus service and want people to use it. Whereas in Wanaka, if you don't have that option, you just simply don't have public transport available at this point in time. So timing those things so that they align, or making sure you've considered it. Yeah, well, if that's right, there's cause and effect, but you know, the sequencing, and I mean, we touched on it in Monica the other day, that, you know, you wouldn't just go bang and go, you know, pay parking over the whole town centre. You'd go, well, these are the starting points and we'll see how it goes, and then you'd sort of expand it as and you might then go, well, so leave it to getting public transport or
So for Queenstown, it's a step change, but as long as you've got that infrastructure sitting there as well, so public transport, the modal shift with the cycleways and ferry service, whatever it might be, which it does have. In Wanaka, you don't have that, but Queenstown certainly does. So it's,
So then in Monica, it's also about, so it's basic allocation. You know, you have paid parking for 30 minutes or an hour, you pay and then encourage people to move on, so you get that turnover with the mix of long-term parking. You know, and I don't know, where's the view on the waterfront parking? Is that could be paid parking, time restricted parking?
A bit of both is the answer. I think is that there might be, and I don't think it's the first thing to do. Like I said, I think you do Dungarvan Street and Dunmore Street, and then you do the bit in front of the town centre, and then you have progressively, as you move further away from the town centre, you increase the time limits. I think it's the sort of fairly simple principles, but it's complicated to sort of design. But
you can also, I mean, if you generate revenue, council might also decide to use that revenue for other centre city enhancements, improvements, or support public transport, or do a whole lot of other things.
And as Tony pointed out at the Monica meeting, you know, we do have a slightly different obligation on reserves as well. Is that, you know, we're providing parking for the enjoyment of the reserve, not for access to the town centre. So you've got to find that balance. So you actually want people to be able to park and go for a swim without a charge, but not necessarily in the town centre, but further up. And that's where McDougall Street and some of the stage 2 parking really needs to be available for that reason. Interestingly, someone the other day, and I think it was actually Matt Woods, I think, was actually promoting the idea that we charge for the Wanaka Tree car park. And I'd always thought that was too far out to worry about, but the type of demand it gets and things like that, there it might be a case for it, you know. And then we, you know, once again, there might be a resident or club members that, so for Rowan Club, they might have a sticker to say they can park there without having to pay for it. So whatever it is. And the same,
I think that residence permit really opens up, because then we're actually targeting the people that we want to charge the most. And I like the idea of the residence permit for the first 3 hours. Do you know what I mean? Because most things that people are going to want to do in town is going to be for 3 hours, and they get it at the discounted rate. Or
I mean, we discovered through Lyle that there are a whole bunch of people that were turning up there in the morning and parking and going out to big building sites out in West Wanaka and taking up 12 car parks in the Wanaka Tree car park. And we're just going, why are those cars there all day? And so he somehow picked it up and then asked, just with a couple of phone calls, actually displaced about a dozen cars that didn't need to be there. You know, so it's really interesting behaviour.
that kind of follows up. My question is, this parking management, is it just parking and we're not talking about new car parks or anything? Like, is that not part of your remit?
Not in this particular work stream, but what we can do once we have the better understanding, once we're monitoring the occupancy of these, we'll know the level of parking and what's required, and that will inform us whether we need more parking spaces or not.
Because I guess to the points before, if you're coming in from somewhere else and you want to park for 12 hours in the day, if you're going to displace them and they have nowhere else to go, I mean, that's when I think people will get angry. I understand the management, but if there's nowhere else to park, close-ish to town, and we are taking it away and we haven't provided anything else, and we don't have public transport, like I get it if we're trying to load shift, but we're not giving them any other option.
The Queenstown transport business case, I think, was 1,100, and it required that the case that we're still working on requires 1,100 new off-street parking places, spots in downtown Queenstown, and of which we've provided 0. Now,
we've got senior street.
Well, as I said, permanently, we've provided zero, because we've got part of Lakeview, we've got part of Stanley Street, neither of which are permanent solutions. You know, that yes, they'll take some of the heat for some time, but, you know, equally, if you think, you know, people keep going, oh, just build a parking building up behind the fire station at Wanaka, or build underground on Pembroke Park. I mean, those things are worse than hypothetical. They are, you know, false hope, quite frankly. And, you know, we've done, what, 3 business cases in Queenstown, certainly 2, for parking buildings, and they just don't stack up.
I mean, really, you want night shift. Like,
Yeah, well.
And I personally, as a commuter to Queenstown, I would park outside if you free up. Like, I'd park in Frankton or somewhere and then get a bus in, or a gondola. If it didn't take, you know, if it freed up, and I think that's where we need to, and same with Wanaka, and same with, like, a lot of people say to me, if you're gonna push tourism, which we do, but you don't provide any spots for them in the town centre for big caravans, it's our fault, you know, like, we need to give them spaces to go, or we need for them to park outside and be able to get into town easy. Like,
I think it's worth noting as well that there'll be some business calibration in this for the commuters as well, because there's a lot of businesses that won't be able to tolerate their staff leaving every 2 hours to move their car. So there will be some pressures that will come from a different direction, which would require people to make shift in some form.
But we got to help with that motion, or the Otago Regional Council.
A lot of it is still attitude change, though. You know, those who hate public transport the most are the ones who've never ridden on a bus before.
Yeah.
So it's, you know, the probably a life survey we just saw sort of indicates that.
Yeah.
But once you do create that friction, and I notice with my own staff, once you take away the car parks, they do start using public transport.
Yeah.
And cycling.
As long as they have
People are motivated by avoiding pain.
Yeah.
So,
Lesser two evils.
what's the primal thing? I think as well, just to speak to the residents and differential pricing, that's part of the bigger thing. And with the rates increases, everyone's telling me, for God's sakes, get the money out of the people who are here, who we're funding all of this public infrastructure for. Car parks being a big one. You know, spend all this money on public land and public space to then not charge it or to give it away. Yeah, I mean, the fact that the whole system for funding roads is completely screwed up in my mind as well. Because road user charges are paid per kilometre, but you only drive on half the roads that funding is going to go towards, and it gets sucked up into Auckland anyway. Like, a whole bunch of dumb things. Let's not do more dumb things.
It's not doing more dumb
No,
things.
That's our
2026
So just, Tony's going to try and summarise the last year and a half. Succinct points.
Did you get a direction?
I think I did. I narrowed it down to 4 bullet points if I can. The first of those is equity, making sure we are looking at those user groups and treating everybody as we should. The second bit is about clarity, explaining the reason, the rationale that we are doing it. Very high on the list is technology first, because that enables everything to happen. And the scale is currently correct, although we acknowledge we can expand it at some time. The only one that leaves out is timing, aimed at 2027. As quickly as we can is the sort of underlying message, but all at the same time. Different areas first, simpler ones first, part implement.
What's easier to execute?
When you have the equity piece worked out.
So just to help you, Tony, because in terms of the CBD here, we've already got an existing parking layout, parking restrictions, so we're doing some changes to that.
Yes.
Over in Wanaka, we're talking about introducing brand new paid parking in areas and allocating that. Frankton, a bit of a mix. So that, for me, they are different sort of pictures. In the CBD, how much change is there from what's currently on the ground in terms of physical markings? You know, not time restrictions, because we've got a lot of, you know, if it's changed from P60 to P30, that's one thing. But
the signs and lights is the simplest part of it. Putting in the parking meters is also relatively simple, but a little bit more expensive. It's having it all documented for the approvals, the TMB bylaw, so it's enforceable.
But I think, and it's because of the technology backbone to this that allows that differential parking becomes critical. If we're going to push that as a reason for doing this.
And enables the monitoring of the occupancy, which helps us with setting up the price.
So they're moving it, like each region's moving at different paces, right? So it can't work simultaneously, can it? Is that what I'm getting?
The thing that binds them together is putting the technology in place to understand it all.
Yeah.
And the permission to use that. In terms of the individual areas, I mean, they're all pretty important. Wanaka before we get the problem. Frankton before we get to displacement problems, and Queenstown because it's the most complex.
Catching up with Queenstown.
It's just going back to the, getting rid of the free 12-hour thing. And, because if you take people off Farm Street, where's the next place that they go to? And is there an option to have some paid parking that actually people still pay to contribute, but actually does enable that longer period that's not prohibitive? Because it'd be interesting to see whether it's a case of people just want to leave their car somewhere for 12 hours or whether they just don't want to pay. And I think people shouldn't have an expectation that they can just come in and have something for free. Yeah. Free. So maybe we can test that. What would a 12-hour thing look like? Because you could argue you better get 12 hours for the money than
charge for free.
That might just provide an option. I don't know.
That's part of the reason we've left the Lakeview car park at a reasonably low level, part of hourly rates, as opposed to the town centre ones, which are significantly more, because it's a facility which is not filling up. So what we want to do is displace that to where, so we manage the parking rather than just react to it. So there is spaces to park, it's just going to cost. And that's, in terms of behavioural change, that means you might have to share the ride with somebody else to half that cost, or quarter that cost with somebody else.
Like, again, though, if I use my own staff, which I've got 12, there is the option in Lakeview, because they're all working Bricken Street. It's a perfect example. They choose to ride the bus because it's cheaper.
Yeah.
And that comes down to where they are in their career.
In terms of rollout, is it problematic if you only roll out part of it and then it just pushes people away, and then you roll out the next part and pushes people away? Like saying that there's interdependencies between the whole wider network strategy, say in Wanaka, that it would be problematic if you just had a fraction, because it's essentially not addressing the real concern, which is more holistic to the work that's been done.
I think in Queenstown, I think you would need to do, personally, I think you would need to do it all together, because you'll just displace other uses. I think that's why we separated the three areas out, because they all could be done individually, and I don't think that will greatly affect that bigger picture.
Yeah. Thank you. Makes sense. Cool. Great job and great team. Very good. All the way.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Good luck.
We'll get it on this training. Maybe.
Yeah.